Hey guys. Yurizi here. This is part 6 of What If Sakura Became Independent. Hit like and subscribe, and also don't forget to check the author. Let's start.
We are pain, that's all. We are God.
Chapter 34, Toward Better Days, Part 3. Oh, nay-san! Those 3 gleeful syllables were Sakura's only warning before a pair of arms flopped over her shoulders, a warm body suddenly pressed tight against her back. That could have been hands with a garrote, was Sakura's first thought as her body instinctively tensed, but then the syllables coalesced. And she relaxed, just a fraction, because there was only one person who'd ever called her that. Fu-san? She asked, craning her head to confirm her guess. Fu's arms slipped from her shoulders as he stepped back and grinned at her, those eerie yellow eyes crinkled up with good humor. My day just got 1200% more interesting, he assured her. I didn't think I'd see again, Wani-san. Did you name your fangs yet? Sakura frowned at him, which made him grin even more widely. They're tools, he said, mimicking her voice. Yeah? No fun, Nei-san? His eyes swept over the cluster of her squad, Tatsuo, Shino, Shikamaru. They were waiting outside for the genin to finish registration for the exam, having already finished processing their own entry into the village and having received a housing assignment. You got a promotion, which is good. But I don't see your team from last time, which might be bad. He stared at her expectantly until Sakura answered. It was, she admitted. Your team. Fu nodded. Yep. Still very dead, he replied, which made her cringe. No promotion for me, though. My new team are Chunin, though. There's one right over there, he said, drawling the word as his eyes sought someone out in the crowd, jabbing a finger when he found them. She's pretty, was her first envious thought, then the ninja happened to shift so that they were in profile. The jawline and laryngeal prominence quickly shifted her opinion to he's still pretty. Given the crowd of boys clustering around him where he was leaning against the wall of a neighboring building, she wasn't the only one who'd let hairstyle and clothing cues lead her opinion. Almost violently red hair was pulled into a high ponytail, bangs allowed to drape in a kind of lazy loop before they'd been tucked back into his hair tie. A plain, sleeveless black shirt with a high collar, black pants. If that had been the end of what he was wearing, he was still pretty enough to cause some confusion. But it wasn't. His wrists were heavy with braided bracelets, no beads or metal to make noise, but still colorful all the same, and his narrow hips were given the illusion of feminine curves by the wrap skirt he wore. The exterior was black, the inside a rich brocade like a very expensive furisuit. The skirt itself was held in place by what looked like an obi, just wrapped rather than tied, the obi itself tethered by colorful obijime, some of these beaded or braided. And it was all in such a masterful coordination of patterns and colors that even Ino wouldn't have had room to criticize. He glanced over at them and Fu waved, which prompted the other shinobi to unfold himself from his position against the wall. They look like they're going to cry, Zen, Fu observed, voice quivering with laughter. Strange how much I don't care, Zen said. I get tired of getting chatted up by men. Maybe you ought to stop being so pretty, came the glib suggestion. Maybe they ought to spend more time honing their powers of observation and less time trying to sound like they have more than 2 brain cells to rub together. Ah, Zen, I'm sure some of them would still talk to you even if they did notice. Yes, because that sounds so much more appealing, Zen said, rolling his eyes, which were a warm brown at this distance. I'll let you know when I'm ready to play to stereotype, just as soon as you prove that the ability to enjoy pattern and color is somehow the exclusive province of women and gay men. Did you need something, Fu? Just to introduce my incredibly not fun teammate to my much better fun friend. Fu raised a hand in a pantomime of a gossiping housewife. Don't mind him. He gets defensive in front of strangers. Another eye roll from the much taller shinobi. Anyhow, Fu said, long sleeves flopping over the ends of his fingers as he gestured from one party to the other. Haruno Sakura and company, meet Momiji Zen. Zen, meet Sakura. And who are you? Shikamaru asked, his posture not quite casual enough to have not recognized Fu. Amihara Fu, came the cheerful reply. Is she the reason you were bullying us to take the assignment to play nanny to the Konoha ninja? Zen demanded touchily. Yep, Fu reported, flashing him a double victory sign. Nei-san has bite. I promise you'll like her. The older shinobi sighed. Both Shino and Shikamaru were watching the ninja with purple-tinted hair warily, but Tatsuo was watching it all with a faint smile. You have interesting friends, Sakura, he remarked when he noticed her looking. I'm Hyuga Tatsuo, he said as he shifted to come stand beside her. I'm the leader of this extra security detail. If you're our liaison, it's a pleasure. She knew he couldn't have missed the boy's discomfort, but Tatsuo was much lower key than the two younger members of Team 7, without any Kakashi-sensei's apparent apathy. She could only describe him as a comfortable person. In the time he'd been her partner, he never failed to make her feel more at ease. It was a very strange thing, to suddenly realize that while she might not have had all those years at the academy with him, she'd been on more missions with Tatsuo than she had with Team 7. Are we going to be rendezvousing with the rest of your team? Tatsuo asked. I'm sure they'll show up. Eventually, Zen replied, his tone one of sardonic long-suffering. They already give you your housing assignments? Nyctophobia. 2 days into the exams and everything was proceeding smoothly, except Ino was suffering a severe case of hair and outfit envy. Her first comment on meeting Zen was a less than quiet, finally. A man who knows how to take care of himself, with a pointed look toward her own squad mates. Shikamaru had only sighed, but Chuji had looked hunted. For now, Sakura sat in opened window, the cool night air playfully tousling her bangs. Her back was pressed against the frame to avoid becoming too much of a backlit silhouette. The other members of her squad and Zen's, the other 2 members had shown up at the last moment, ranged along the long hall that housed roughly half of the Konoha entrance. Tatsuo stood on the other side of the window from which she sat, but he was silent. They were both listening. There were also guards posted on the roof, but they'd also bear a share of the blame if one of their charges managed to slither out a window and make trouble. Then, smells like rain, Tatsuo remarked very softly. Sakura hummed an affirmative reply. The air was sweet with the scent of rain falling elsewhere, being driven on the wind that stirred her hair and the clouds whose bellies were intermittently lit with lightning that was distant only for the moment. They'd probably see a summer squall before the night was out, but the prospect of a storm didn't seem to deter the crowds that still filled the street. Unlike the foreign shinobi, whose curfew fell at sundown, the civilians and native shinobi were enjoying the festival atmosphere in the streets below. The smells and sounds wafting up presented a not inconsiderable temptation to join the fun, which was only exacerbated a moment later as fireworks began to join the natural light display. She wasn't able to see the lake from where she sat, but Sakura was certain that it would be a spectacle worth seeing, the lights reflecting against the flat, glossy blackness of the water, perhaps shedding enough light in the instant before they disappeared to see the distant branches of the great tree. The village of Taki was founded in a caldera of mind-boggling scale, with the residential and mercantile districts clustered along the rim of the extinct volcano. The central portion of the village, its seats of government and military complexes, were located on an island that had been built at the center of a vast lake, in which they'd rooted a tree even more enormous than Konoha's fire beaches in an effort to prevent erosion. Aside from water walking or a boat, the only way to reach the island was by a bridge that was almost the equal of Tezuna's. The lake was fed from the yearly snow melt and rivers of the adjoining mountain range, themselves possessing several nice examples of the titular waterfalls, but none so picturesque as the ones that plunged hundreds of feet to the valley floor on the opposite rim of the caldera. It was in an effort to ignore the spectacle of the fireworks, because, really, she wasn't made of stone and festival food came with a ready-made excuse that it was a special occasion, that she focused her gaze on the wall of the hotel rather than the crowds in the street. She didn't know if she'd have seen it otherwise, though seen was precisely the correct verb. Felt was very imprecise, but there it was. A distortion in the way she perceived the world, that faint wrongness that marked a genjutsu. If she tilted her head just so, she could make out distortions in the air that marked the contours of a body under a chameleon technique. Very chakra-intensive, Sakura thought as she watched the figure slip from the second-floor window to the ground. In an instant, there was another festival goer where the ninja had landed, the transition so smooth in the crowded street that no one looked twice. Sakura waited for others to follow or intercept the shinobi, but as he or she began winding through way along the street, there was no indication that anyone else had seen. For an instant, she was very tempted to pretend she'd seen nothing. The ninja housed on that floor weren't from her village and weren't her responsibility. But when seconds ticked past, marked by the thump of her heartbeat, still no one went to retrieve the shinobi. And she couldn't quite sell herself on the idea that they were allowing him or her to run for a reason. Sakura didn't think of herself as a brave person, not even all these missions after Wave. Brave was for people like Naruto. She only ever wanted to make it home. Following orders, following the rules, that was the surest method to make it home even in dangerous times. Chasing after foreign ninja in the dark? That was asking for trouble. What is it? Tatsuo murmured, having slipped away from his side of the window to stand behind her, one hand resting lightly on her shoulder, his head so near hers that the thump of her heartbeat seemed to stutter. But the moment was swallowed by the anxiety of the decision that she was about to make. Second floor, she said in a low voice. A ninja exited under cover of Genjutsu from the window. No signs of pursuit. His fingers tightened incrementally on her shoulder. Do you still have a visual? Yes. Tatsuo straightened. Sakura's seen someone exit the building. Second floor. We're going to pursue. No one else is pursuing? Zen asked, standing upright from where he'd been leaning against the wall. They were under Genjutsu, Sakura volunteered. And no one else noticed this? Just her? Zen asked, finely arched eyebrows soaring toward his hairline. Sakura's exceptionally sensitive to Genjutsu, Tatsuo replied evenly. I doubt any of your chunin could match her skill. Zen looked faintly incredulous, but gave instructions to his teammates to stay behind. Lead, Tatsuo said, we'll follow. So Sakura pitched herself out the window, her soft-soled boots hardly making a noise as she landed on a nearby roof. She didn't look behind to confirm the presence of the others, because her prey was almost out of sight. Tugging her shimok up the bridge of her nose to minimize the risk of her pale skin attracting notice, she had a moment's gratefulness to Mariko for convincing her to leave her skirts for activities that involved less midnight pursuits across rooftops. And given how badly her red top had clashed with the dark olive of the standard flak jacket, she'd switched out tops to a deep gray. One day she'd save up enough to replace the Chunin standard body armor with something custom, but right now she was outgrowing shoes, reading through expensive reference books, and sourcing tools as fast as her mission pay came in. For now, though, it was enough to have the reassuring weight of her knives and the knowledge of Tatsuo at her back. Though they made better time by the rooftops than her target made in the street, she stalked him or her with care. Given the smoothness with which they kept shifting their appearance, Sakura was beginning to suspect it wasn't a Chunin candidate they were following. Zen's air of skepticism had vanished, his dark eyes tracking the movement of their mark even as they took a moment to wait behind the ridgeline of a roof. Though he or she was being subtle about it, they were checking for pursuit. What's in this direction that they could be interested in? Shikamaru asked. The settlement tapers out in this direction, so it turns pretty quickly into forest. But before that, you have the area where we're housing the Sunanin, Zen reported grimly. So far out from the rest of the entrance. Well, the elders thought there would be less trouble if we limited the interaction between Konoha and Suna, Zen replied, shifting incrementally higher on the roof and then signaling for them to proceed. Maybe they were right to be worried. It could be, Tatsuo acknowledged. But if he came from a second-floor window, they aren't necessarily a Konoha shinobi. At least not one traveling with the main party. We were all assigned rooms on the 4th and 5th floors. We'll see, Zen replied. There, he said, pointing out not another large hotel like the one they'd been staying in, but rather a series of buildings. Taki's location makes it unsuitable for it to also be the trade center of our nation, he murmured at their confusion. So, not enough steady visitors needing lodging to build large hotels. We do better with smaller inns. Question, Shino interjected. Just how close are we going to allow our target to get to his target? Would it not be safer to simply interrogate him later? If we could be certain he was working alone, yes. Otherwise, no, Tatsuo replied. Whoever we're tracking is either very brave or very stupid to be acting alone, if his aim is revenge. He's being even more foolish if the goal is to cause trouble between our villages. You think so? Shikamura said. I can think of a lot of ways one shinobi could sabotage our relationship with Suna. We're not exactly on the best of terms, you know. That's odd, Zen remarked. What's odd? Tatsuo asked, rather than attempt to refute Shikamura's assertion. He's moving toward the forest, rather than the inns, Sakura replied. Perhaps the Byakugan should be used to attempt to ascertain his objective? Shino suggested. It's not a pair of night vision goggles, Sakura replied defensively on Tatsuo's behalf. It's fine, the older ninja said. But she's right to say it isn't precisely night vision. It'll be much easier if I don't try to do this and run at the same time. Go ahead and continue pursuit. We'll catch up. Zen nodded sharply, then he was off in a soft rustle of cloth. Shikamaru and Shino hesitated a moment longer before following. Tatsuo, Sakura said. In the uncertain light cast up from the streets below, she could still see the small, wry smile that shifted his lips. It's only a little pain, he said. But the breath that shifted his shoulders betrayed a far greater trepidation, as did the fine tremor that traveled along the length of the hand that had shifted comfortingly to her shoulder. He closed his eyes and she felt his breath catch as the veins just below his temples bulged. His eyes snapped open, seemingly searching blindly for things well beyond human vision. A soft, breathy stream of invective punctuated the night, and as she watched, a blood vessel burst in his right eye, turning Descara red. Though she knew that what was causing the blood vessels to burst was far worse than the damaged vessels themselves, it was visible evidence that Tatsuo was hurting, just as his hand trembling on her shoulder was. Sakura reached up to clasp her hand over his. In response, his fingers tensed against her shoulder, then he released her abruptly, eyelids fluttering shut. What part of that was a little pain? Sakura demanded, feeling utterly useless and sort of wretched because of it. Right then and there, though he'd explained why Tsunade-sama would never be able to attempt to correct the damage to his eyes, Sakura decided that for once in her life belonging to a family rather than an expansive, intergenerational eye would be useful. She would find a way to give Tatsuo back his Genjutsu. She'd never be a medic proper, would never serve an internship or residency in a hospital, but she was clever enough to serve this more selfish purpose. Just as she knew that her chances of survival increased if she didn't have to depend on dragging herself to a medic and handling poisons was a stupid enterprise without a solid knowledge of antidotes, she couldn't allow Tatsuo to suffer because she was afraid of making the effort. She ignored the part of her brain that sneered at that thought, that told her that it was more than just effort, that even if there wasn't a Genjutsu involved it would have been an incredibly sensitive injury. Her demand made Tatsuo smile, pained as it was. The part where I talk about it to other people. At least it was useful. Useful? Our target isn't the only one in the woods. I can't see them well enough to make out detail, but it looks like there are 10 others in there with him. I have a rough idea of where they're going. It seemed like they were meeting, rather than seeking something. 11? Sakura echoed. That many? Definitely not genin out to make trouble, was Tatsuo's reply. Let's catch up to the others. The rest of the group hadn't gone far. Shino had managed to coax a female beetle onto their target, so they'd been able to trail him from a distance with less chance of discovery. Shit, Zen said with deep feeling. 11? 11, Tatsuo confirmed. Shikamura sighed. I guess it would be too much to hope for that they're just meeting for an extra wild party, and we can go back and leave them to it? A soft sound drew their attention upwards, where the first drops of rain heralded a cloudburst that smote them only seconds later. So troublesome, he sighed, this time more deeply. Well, how do we handle this? Numbers favor them, which means that surprise is our best weapon, but since we don't actually know that they're doing anything beyond breaking curfew, we're probably going to have to send a clone while everyone conceals themselves. Then, if they don't disperse, we attack. Anyone capable of a jutsu that would let us send word we might have reinforcements. When only silence met him, he said, I was afraid of that. So, who has the best clone? I believe, Shino volunteered quietly, I am the most capable of producing a substantial clone that will not be recognized as such. My hives are sufficiently developed to produce 2 such clones, If you wish to send for reinforcements, I can provide such a service at the expense of my offensive abilities. When Shikamaru shook his head, he continued. If it turns out that their intentions are hostile, I can also subdue several of the shinobi quickly. Shikamaru nodded. All right, he said. That should probably be our goal. Non-fatal capture. If feasible, he allowed, glancing over at Sakura, who scowled back at him, despite not having family techniques, or chakra-devouring bugs, or the flexible jukin she managed. Mostly. Paralytic poisons and genjutsu were best, as Sakura was beginning to suspect Tsunade-sama had honed her talents as a medic needing first to combat things like ruptured organs. Experience was her teacher concerning chakra-enhanced strength. No one seemed to have written anything about it, and even if she'd gathered the courage to ask advice from Tsunade-sama, she respected the fact that the Sannin was in charge of the recovery of her village after a major attack after an extremely long absence. Though the traditional alliances between the clans might have held true, the heads of several clans had changed, the internal politics of the village had continued to develop and shift in her absence, and policies and practices had continued to evolve. That was before factoring in the fallout from the invasion. Sakura did not envy her that monumental task. One day, though, especially if she made jounin, she'd ask. Even if by that time she'd figured it out herself. Those thoughts were quickly dismissed as the five of them dispersed. Sakura found herself belly down on a forest floor, not a totally unfamiliar position, but the rain that continued to pound down made it an uncomfortable one. Though it represented an advantage if any of their targets had enhanced olfactory senses like Kiba and provided a visual barrier, it could turn a bit chilly even in warm weather. Also, though she'd taken to binding her long hair back in a fabric sheath, if anyone grabbed it, the sheath slid free, sort of like a lizard losing a bit of tail. She still wore bangs to break up the shape of her face. And hair plastered against her forehead wasn't precisely pleasant. Luckily, Shino didn't keep them waiting long. There'd hardly been any conversation among the 11 ninja, which made Sakura wonder if they were waiting for some sort of signal. They all tensed in concert as Shino's clone stepped out from behind a tree, lantern in hand. Not as himself, she vaguely recognized the Takigekure Jounin, and he demanded, "What are you doing out here? Curfew for foreign was hours ago." One of the ninjas stepped forward, a woman with a low, raspy voice. "I think not. If you want to blame anyone for what will happen tonight, blame Konoha and Suna, who couldn't manage to destroy each other somewhere far away. Or maybe your elders, who agreed to let an unstable foreign Jinchuriki inside your borders." Shino's clone stiffened. "What do you intend to do?" he asked. "Break the stranglehold of two great villages," the Kunoichi sneered. "No one will trust Suna, and with Konoha unable to meet demand, well, you understand." And then, without any further warning than that, the attack began. The Kunoichi had whipped out a blade with the rough, functional lines of a machete, which Sakura didn't doubt would have cut bone and flesh as easily as vegetation, but when she slashed into Shino's clone she was met with a black haze of kikaichu rather than blood. Only eyes familiar with them would notice how sluggish their flight seemed, how much the rain interfered with their ability to fly. The lantern the clone had been holding fell to the ground, giving them just enough light to fight by. There was a keening sound as two razor-edged chakrams burst through the brush, one cutting through a ninja's arm with such force only a thin layer of skin and muscle kept it from dropping to the ground. That would be Zen, interpreting non-fatal liberally. She'd wondered what had been hiding in those large, square pouches dangling from the back of that complex configuration of Obijime. His melee weapons were the Fonghuoluan, the paired wind and fire wheels. Circular like the chakrams, a quarter of their hoop shape was unsharpened and padded, with an interior crossguard. The other 3/4 had short, flame-styled blades protruding. But Sakura didn't have time to admire his technique. Her chosen target had just unfolded an urumi from about his waist. Like the bastard child of a whip and a sword, it had 5 flexible metal tongues, each of them sharp enough to slice her open though not enough to cut through bone. That knowledge was not particularly reassuring. Unlike the others, Sakura still hadn't come out of hiding. Fingers weaving into a net of intent, she spilled chakra into her channels just so. And when she released it, the ninja froze, eyes trained on the ghost. Others too, It would have been wasteful not to try, but unlike those hires words on wave, these ninja found it mostly a momentary impediment. With a silent thought of gratitude to Kakashi-sensei, Sakura shoved off and sprinted forward, the handle of her knife impacting her target's head. He fell with an almost silent thud, Sakura going low to duck another shinobi's blow. But the battle hadn't devolved into a fierce knot of combat. Sakura noticed with alarm in the scant moments her new opponent afforded her as she fought him, and her instinct to end it now, the view of the forest and her opponents, made difficult and strange by the poor lighting. There were stragglers who'd stayed to engage them, but the others were all off and running toward their objective. Gaara, Sakura thought with alarm, having heard of that battle from Shikamaru. Plenty clever enough to draw his own conclusions, he'd shared them with Sakura only after Naruto had been weeks away on his journey. In part because he had his own suppositions about Naruto himself. If they have some way of putting Gaara to sleep, she thought, which made her shout, "Shikamaru!" "I know!" He snarled back from where he was fending off a shinobi who wasn't giving him any quarter. Almost counterintuitively, Shikamaru's abilities were severely curtailed on a moonless night like this one. Without a source of light to cast a shadow from his body, he couldn't use it in his family's technique, and the light from their single lantern was making for a very poor situation on his end. As was the speed of his opponent. He must have known how difficult this battle would be for him, but he'd come regardless, when he could have volunteered himself as a courier service. Sakura was struck briefly by admiration of the boy who'd been hands down the laziest in their class, but she earned a hard kick to the sternum from her own opponent for that microsecond of inattention. As she gagged, Tatsuo's deft fingers struck at the back of her opponent's neck, causing him to sink bonelessly to the ground. His own target already lay defeated, her hair shining against wet leaves. "All right?" he asked, deflecting a thrown kunai. "Really ugly bruise." "Be all right when I can breathe," Sakura wheezed, forcing her body to move even as it protested the lack of oxygen. "Need to stop them before they make it back to where the Sunanin are." Tatsuo nodded, and then he was gone, quick and certain even in the dark and the rain. Shikamaru used the uncertain footing of last year's leaves slick with the rain to finally down his own opponent, then he was moving too. Shino had already vanished into the forest after the fleeing shinobi, but then was a flurry of ferocious movement, light catching on his bright brocades. Sakura wondered at his trouble until a moment's stillness alerted her to strange vibration in the ground. Earth manipulation, Sakura realized, which was hard enough to combat in daylight. With only the uncertain light of a single lantern, it had to be a nightmare. He wasn't her partner. He was a Chunin in his own right, and if any of the others got to Gaara, they stood a chance of facing far greater casualties than one Chunin. But when something like a hand jutted up out of the ground, clasping Zen's lower leg and gripping, she couldn't unhear the sound of his bones shattering, nor his shout of pain. Almost before she knew she was moving, the chakra-filled earth was shattering beneath her fist, which brought another howl from Zen as his broken bones were ground against one another from the force of it. Then her shoulder was catching him in the belly as she tossed him up onto her shoulder, not quite fast enough to avoid a spear of earth that tried to drive itself through her ribs. The flak jacket did its work. Without the edge of metal to pierce the fabric, it dispersed the force of the blow across her ribs, one of which gave with a sharp crack and an even sharper stab of pain. Especially when she was bearing Zen's full weight, one hand over his back to keep him from sliding down off shoulders too narrow to do this well, her other arm keeping his skirt from obstructing her. She'd almost mastered her fear of Shunshin, but she'd never done it in pitch-dark forest, everything slick with the rain still beating down. She didn't have a free hand to pull down her combat glasses. What light there was provided by lightning, and it was intermittent at best. The darkness seemed to draw her awareness close to her body, to the beat of her heart, the motion of her lungs, the sounds of her own breathing made horrifically loud. Sakura swallowed down a sick premonition of pain, and then she moved, darting through the trees with no grace but all speed. A rock shifted underfoot and Sakura nearly fell, a warm discomfort blooming in an ankle forced to bear all her weight, and Zen's besides at an angle not meant for weight-bearing. Sakura's plan wasn't to outrun their assailant, who was turning the very earth against them, smaller than Gaara's great sand constructions, but dead was dead, but a brief instance of light revealed a suitably broad tree. Using the hand pressed against Zen's legs, Sakura folded her fingers into a symbol of concentration and left a clone to lead on their pursuer. Flitting behind the tree, she unloaded Zen rather roughly against the bark, fingers twisting nervously into a far more basic chameleon technique than the chakra-draining one that the first shinobi had used. Zen had shifted himself upright, seemed about to do something, but Sakura used her chakra-enhanced strength to press him flush against the tree, hand over his mouth as an indicator for silence. She was stronger than he was, not overall maybe, but incessant practice had changed and was changing the dynamic of sheer brute force between her and everyone else forever, and being so close was a reminder of that. Sakura didn't know what those first abortive struggles were about, unless he didn't trust that she'd be able to conceal them, but they were easily quelled. Her hand wasn't flush against his lips, people tended to bite when you did that, but she could feel his warm breath feathering against her palm, quick and fast like the heartbeat of a bird. Though it slowed as the sound of pursuit faded. Sakura cautiously shifted her hand away, though she kept supporting Zen's weight. Listening carefully, she tried to part the sound of forest and rain from a shinobi waiting for them to break cover. "Zen-san," she whispered, turning back to face him, a brief flash of lightning giving her just enough light to see as he shifted his upper body toward her, lips pressing gently against her own. "That's all the thanks you get," he whispered next to her ear. "Now go." Sakura almost stumbled back. Her own lip balm was the refreshing tang of grapefruit, so the sweetness of strawberry that lingered only momentarily was him. And Sakura could not deal with that just now. So it was back into the dark, hunting someone who could manipulate the ground she stood on. A patch of moss, loosened by the rain, slipped sideways off a rock, taking Sakura with it. She slammed hard into a tree, rough bark scouring her forearm and the side of her face, though her shimok protected most of it. With that much noise, she didn't have to worry about finding him. He found her. Sakura barely had enough warning and presence of mind to leap away as the forest floor exploded in a toothy maw of quick-growing stalagmites. He didn't have Gaara's fine control, the part of her that wasn't screaming "Look out! Look out!" Noted. Even the hand that had broken Zen's leg had been stiff and rudimentary. The only recourse was to keep moving and to move unpredictably, his chakra insufficient to simply overwhelm her with the sheer size of a construction. But this made it hard to close, hard to aim. And her broken rib felt like she was being kicked in the chest every time she had to contort her torso to avoid another strike. Shikamaru's non-fatal could wait for another day, another battle. What she wanted was one good strike. Baring her teeth unconsciously, she used the shunshin technique to cover ever smaller spaces, 10 feet, 5, 2, 7, her flight as jarring as a housefly's. She almost couldn't see, it wasn't just the dark, but the speed. Rocks shifted, branches tried to tear, and he tried to kill her. But then there she was and there he was, and then her knives were ripping into flesh, one in either side of his ribcage, like pinchers closing. It brought her so close it was almost a parody of a hug, and she could feel the warmth of his breath. And she could feel the interruption of it, when blood flooded his lungs, hear the sound as his body struggled not to drown in own fluids. She did not twist, instead bending her knees so she could drive them up, until she supported the full weight of his body on arms that trembled. From adrenaline, from fear, from relief, even if foam-flecked blood was dripping from his lips onto her nose. When she couldn't hear him breathing anymore, she lowered him to the ground, kicking the body free of her knives. She stole a moment to wipe her blades clean before resheathing them. Looking up from her task, she tried to get her bearings. All her tricks to navigate in the woods weren't working, as she disoriented even herself in that last mad rush. She finally had to scurry up a tree and orient herself by the lights of the village. She could go back, get Zen, secure their unconscious ninja. Shunshin was chakra-intensive, and while her physical stamina was fantastic thanks to the Niken, her chakra reserves were more of a work in progress. She was already balanced on the fine edge that threatened to tip her over into exhaustion, where her reflexes would begin to slow and her control would degrade. And for her, who depended on her control, that was a disaster in the making. But Tatsuo was out there in the dark somewhere. He was her partner, the one who was there. She owed him at least that much consideration in return. So she was back to jogging through a dark forest, not willing to risk actually laming herself or missing a battle. The silence was unnerving. She didn't think they'd have gone so far she couldn't hear the crash of kunai against kunai. But there was only the rain, softer now, a susurrus in the leaves. Sakura? Tatsuo's voice came, a welcome sound in the night. So welcome, in fact, that Sakura suspected a trap and slunk in a wide arc that would bring her in at an angle rather than straight on. Sakura? His voice was louder now, and Sakura took to the trees, grimacing when crouching sent waves of pain along her side. There was Tatsuo, lantern in hand without a hint of Genjutsu, and he had someone surprising with him. Tatsuo, Sakura acknowledged as she dropped from her perch, regretting the thoughtless maneuver instantly as it jarred both rib and ankle. Gara-san. The red-headed Nin dipped his head gravely in acknowledgement. I guess this means it's over? She asked. All but the collection and the interrogation, Tatsuo acknowledged. As it turned out, Gara-san has a habit of going out for walks at night. That was what our shinobi hoped to take advantage of. We were making a bit of a ruckus, so he naturally came to investigate. That gave one of our targets the opportunity she'd been waiting for. They'd develop some sort of genjutsu. It's similar to the one I use when Shikaku is more of an asset than an annoyance, which isn't often. But they're hardly the first to have tried, Gara rasped. I carry stimulants. But with 11 of them working in concert, they might have managed it. If they'd managed to take me by surprise, which is unlikely. Sakura managed to dredge up a tired smile. Well, still, I'm glad you're not hurt. Gara blinked at her, and she imagined if he'd had eyebrows, they might have risen in surprise. He seemed to find the concept strange. And you? He responded at last. And me what? Sakura asked. Are you hurt? Nothing that won't heal. Chapter 35, Toward Better Days, Part 4. Fu's upper half was sprawled across the table, both his arms fully outstretched, his chin resting on the tabletop. That's mean, Nei-san, he whined. Having all that fun without me. He just plopped himself down at the table she'd been sharing with Ino, trying to work up the courage to bring up the kiss. It was odd. The kiss. Not just a kiss. The kiss. Her first one. The one that was supposed to belong to the one. The kiss that was supposed to presage her happily ever after, like in all the books and movies and everything else. Alright, maybe not all the books, namely the ones in the box of shame, but they didn't count. Or the old stories, where hardly anyone lived happily for any length of time, but they didn't count either. She'd decided that kiss belonged to Sasuke back when she decided she belonged with Sasuke, before he'd gone and betrayed everything they'd been taught to serve and protect. After that, it just hadn't occurred to her to spend her time in imagining the kiss with anyone else, as if that part of her had left with him. It helped that she hardly left herself any time for that sort of thing anymore, too busy studying and sparring and learning to live in a world where sleeping in was sometimes something unwelcome. She'd certainly never imagined the kiss would happen when her heart had been galloping from the fright and anxiety of battle rather than the intensity of her feelings. Zen was probably the most beautiful boy she was ever going to meet, and he was nice enough, but he was basically a stranger. She wasn't angry, because she didn't have any sense of anything being stolen, and it had been special, sort of, but she still wanted to know what it meant, that he'd kissed her like that, but she didn't want to bring it up in front of Fu, who was now sulking at her. Because we had so much time to go looking for you while you were out playing around, Zen said as he cautiously lowered himself into another chair. They'd healed his leg enough that he was in a walking cast, making Ino gape, though she recovered quickly. Next time we're trailing someone, I'll stop and think, wait, maybe Fu would like to help out. Exactly like that, but without sarcasm, Fu agreed. Zen just stared at Fu for a long moment. It must be a strange thing to live in your head, he remarked at last. Anyway, before I forget, you and I have a dinner to attend this evening, he said to Sakura. What? Sakura said. Well, squeaked, but she'd save what dignity she could, especially as Ino was now staring. A brief, knowing smile flashed across Zen's face. Your squad, me, and Suna no Gara, we're going to be having dinner with the elders. Congratulations for us, an apology for him. Having delivered that news, she might have expected him to leave, but he and Fu stayed and made conversation for a while until something else nabbed Fu's attention and Zen had to leave for an appointment. Almost the instant Zen was out of sight, Ino's fingers were latched onto her arm, likely as a measure against Sakura bolting. "All right, confess," she demanded. "What was that?" "What was what?" Sakura asked grumpily, hating to be put on the spot even if this exact conversation had been her earlier goal. "You," flustered. Pretty boy smirking. "I don't know, what could I be curious about?" Ino replied snarkily. All right, Sakura said, eyes flittering over the others enjoying the sunlight in the park. Which was stupid, some part of her brain told her, because no one else likely cared, but it was habit. When she told Ino about her lightning-lit kiss, the other girl made strangled noises of what sounded mostly like giddiness and envy. When she posed her question, about what the kiss meant, Ino mulled it over thoughtfully. "Not speaking as a voice of experience or anything," Ino said, "but it's probably one of those victory kisses. You know, he thinks you're cute and he's grateful and caught up in the moment, but he doesn't necessarily want to date you. Which is probably a good thing. Taki's far enough away that he'd be less boyfriend and more pen pal. But I have to say, Sakura, for a first kiss? Nice," she drawled appreciatively, which set them both to giggling. "Philia." Sakura almost toppled over backwards when a hand suddenly covered the text she'd been reading, a strangled noise only about half as embarrassing as an actual shriek escaping her throat. After she'd snatched at the heavy table and managed to right her chair, Sakura looked up sheepishly to find Tatsuo wearing an expression of exasperated indulgence. "What are you doing?" he asked. "Reading?" Sakura tried after a brief silence, because she was too ashamed to admit that there were aspects of her medical studies that she found mind-numbingly boring. Not that she expected or needed novels, but many of the books and even case studies tended to be dense and almost purposefully inaccessible. They were academically standoffish in a way that was as unlike the highly simplified academy texts as it was possible to be without being another language entirely, full of new and difficult terms that required a dictionary on one hand and a notebook on the other. "Strange, how much that resembled almost falling asleep on the book," he remarked wryly. "How long have you been at this, Sakura?" "Not long," she demurred. "Really? Because, strangely enough, I saw someone who looked remarkably like you sitting in this seat this morning. As it is now dinner time, I think you've earned a break." He happened to glance down and grimaced. "If you don't leave now, I'm going to be obliged to tell Hokage-sama that you came this close to drooling on her work." "I don't drool," Sakura bit out defensively as she gathered her things, cheeks flushed pink. "You don't," Tatsuo confirmed. "But the Hokage won't know that." As they left the library, where Sakura had spent the better part of her day making good use of its collection, he glanced down at her. His expression softened as he said, "If you keep this up, I might start to think you don't like working with me." "What? Why?" Sakura demanded, perplexed. "This much study and practice, you'll be jounin' before you're old enough to drink," Tatsuo replied. "Especially if our missions keep going so smoothly." Sakura hugged her notebook tighter to her chest, made uncomfortable by the reminder that if she made jounin, she would no longer be part of her current squad. While parting from Ehara Taishu and the others would give her a feeling no worse than she'd felt when saying goodbye to the greater part of her graduating class, she'd really regret not working with Tatsuo anymore. But Tatsuo was unlikely to make jounin again, no matter how remarkable his salvaging of his career. Too much of his early training had focused on the use of his Genjutsu. Without his memory, even his Juken would be just another thing stolen from him in the course of that one terrible mission. "Quit that," he said softly. "You're supposed to reassure me that I'm your favorite partner, not look guilty." "Sorry," Sakura mumbled. "And you are my favorite partner. Given that I've had just the one, that's not so bad, I guess." Tatsuo laughed and laughed all the harder when Sakura's stomach growled audibly. "Here," he said when she would have stomped toward home, "let me save you from yourself. If you've spent the entire day drowning in big words, I doubt you have any plans that I'll interrupt. And if you come with me, you won't have to cook," he pointed out. It was not a difficult decision, but Sakura grew progressively more hesitant as he led the way not to any of their favorite restaurants, but somewhere she'd never been before. "The Hyuga compound." "Tatsuo," Sakura said with trepidation, not comfortable with the glances she was getting from white-eyed passerby. If you stop looking like you're trespassing and aware of it, no one will look twice, Tatsuo said. Then suddenly he was behind her, hands on her shoulders, propelling her through a gate. Unlike the Uchiha district, where houses directly fronted the streets, many of the houses they'd passed seemed to have small walled yards or gardens attached to them. Perhaps in a place where so many people had a Genjutsu no normal wall was proof against, the illusion was privacy was doubly important. And there was the fact that for all that Uchiha name was more infamous, the Hyuga line had been wealthy and well established long before their wild offshoot. They'd been given considerable space when the village had been established, and unlike the fated Senju and massacred Uchiha, they'd flourished. The Hyuga were now the most powerful clan in Konohagakure. But quietly. "Haha," he called, which made her want to bolt, but there was nothing to be done about it before a woman emerged from the house. She was older than Sakura had thought she'd be, fine lines bracketing her eyes, but less alarming than she'd expected. There was elegance there, but it had been worn by time to something comfortable and inviting. "Tadaima. I'm delivering your dinner guest," Tatsuo told the woman, laughter in his voice, and she smiled back at him. "I see that," she replied. "Tusan's setting the table, so you're just in time. Okiri, children. Canophilia." There'd been a long-ago conversation in which Kakashi-senpai had explained the difference between his Niken and summons. Summoned animals weren't really animals in any sense but form. They were spirits who would outlive their contractors, who lived in places that weren't casually accessible to humans. Their contracts were rare, while companion animals, personal summons or contracted animals were acceptable terms too, were far more common. They had human-level intelligence and commiserate lifespans, often living and dying with their shinobi. She tucked the information away, because that was what she did, but she'd never expected this. "It's like a pet store where the pets choose you," Pakin explained as he trotted at her ankles. "Crossed with a matchmaker's. Pups' parents can make decisions for them, if a shinobi prefers to partner with someone they can raise and train up as they like. You don't see adult animals there very often, mostly genin equivalents, so there's still plenty of raising to do even for the ones old enough to make their own choices. And you can start contributing to this conversation at any point," he said to Kakashi, who was trailing behind them. "You're doing fine without me," he replied carelessly without looking up from his book, waving them forward. Sakura envied him his spatial awareness. She'd tried to duplicate the ability, an experiment that had left her only with bruised pride. Pakin huffed, his little tail twitching indignantly, but he was distracted when Sakura asked, "So, the Niken, did you all choose senpai, or did he take you in as pups?" "Both. He didn't take us all in at once, you understand," Pakin said. Then he snorted. "You should have seen him the first time he tried to raise a puppy. Let's just say that it's a mercy that no one was ever fool enough to let him near human babies." "You know, I am right here," Kakashi-senpai remarked flatly. "You were the one who didn't want to join the conversation," Sakura pointed out with mock innocence. "Don't be mean to your senpai, Kohai," Kakashi-senpai chided as he clapped his book shut and strode briskly forward to catch up to them, slowing to match Pakin's pace when he'd drawn even with them. "Especially when he's taking you out to get a puppy." Pakin took this as permission to continue regaling Sakura with stories from when the Niken were young and Kakashi-senpai was as well. Younger Kakashi-senpai insisted, not young, because that would make him old, until they reached the expansive building that was their destination. Despite Pakin's comparison, it wasn't a pet shop. There were no large windows so you could gawk at the companion animals. There was a large, easily readable sign atop the entrance, but it was closer to the ones that labeled civic buildings rather than an advertisement. It had the feel of one as well, because they were immediately greeted by a desk manned by a sober member of the Inuzuka clan. They were instructed to sign in and were issued visitor badges, which they were required to wear at all times within the premises. They waited by the desk as the woman called someone to escort them, but it wasn't a long wait. It was a younger woman who emerged through the doors, her long hair pulled neatly up into a ponytail and unfamiliar clan markings on her face. A thick blue line bisected her chin, and another ran from cheek to cheek across the bridge of her nose. "Hi," she said brightly. "I'm Nakoda Kao. Do you have your paperwork ready?" Sakura glanced worriedly over at Kakashi-senpai. Because she hadn't been aware of any paperwork, had been entirely surprised this morning when he'd shown up at her door and announced where they were going. She wasn't even sure she could cover the fees, and surely there would be fees. But she kept her mouth shut as Kakashi-senpai produced a packet of paperwork and handed it over. Good, Nakoto-san said. Now, if you want to come to my office while I process this, it shouldn't take long. Again, it wasn't a long wait, though the girl occasionally asked Sakura to clarify points, making thoughtful noises. Well, she said when she was satisfied, it looks like you're an excellent candidate, Sakura-san. Now, would you like to meet our animals? Sakura nodded hesitantly and was rewarded by being led into a vast room which was populated by animals in all shapes, sizes, and species. Some could speak with human voices, others yapped, yelled, and chirped to produce an exuberant cacophony. There were other workers wearing clothes identical to Nekota's, all of them sporting clan markings on their faces. Other shinobi with visitors' passes accompanied them, the animals reacting like academy children to a guest speaker. Excited, but too aware of the possibility of scolding by their sensei to mob them. Nekoto-san gave them both a moment to absorb the room, Sakura's eyes skimming over dozens of adorable dogs of all ages. Ferocious-looking ones too, like the ones the Inuzuka clan partnered with, though not many of those. She was overwhelmed by sheer choice and the repercussions if she made the wrong one, but in the midst of all that confusion, something niggled at her mind. Some not quite right in the world. She turned, seeking the source, until her gaze landed on a tall cabinet well away from the excitement. What's a Genjutsu doing there? She thought to herself as she crept towards it. Sakura-san? Nakoto-san asked. There's something here, Sakura replied distractedly, her will already sealing chakra channels in a well-honed reflex. She found herself staring into eyes that weren't green and weren't blue, but some strange, immensely intense shade in between. The cat stood slowly from where it had been crouched, tail flicking. He had a regal, triangular head and large ears, his medium-length fur laying close to his body except for the tail, where it formed a sort of fan. He was very dark, but not a true black, more seal brown, and beginning midway down his tail, the dark hairs gained silvery tips. His ears, too, had that gray sheen, and just the faintest hint of it around his nose. What do you mean? There's nothing? Nakoto-san cut herself off as the cat terminated the illusion. Oh, she said, a wealth of meaning in that single sound. The cat glanced briefly over at her. I want this one, he said plainly. Sakura-san is here to look at dogs, Nakoto-san protested weakly, which was a strange reaction, and coupled with the of moments before conspired to give Sakura a kind of ominous feeling. Nonsense, the cat insisted. She'd be wasted on the imbecilic creatures. Hey, Pakin protested. You can't help it, the cat said condescendingly. A dog is at best a scent tracker. Cats, however, are natural chakra sensors and innately talented in the art of illusion. I don't know why anyone would prefer a dog to a cat. Especially one like myself, he went on without a shred of humility. Could be something like personality, maybe, Kakashi-senpai muttered, which earned a rumble of agreement from Pakin. Nakoto-san winced. This is Sodai, she said. Named himself, did he? Pakin remarked snidely. Don't be ridiculous, the cat sniffed. Ko, see to the paperwork, will you? That's a good girl. The woman seemed to firm her resolve. Sodai, she said patiently, it doesn't work like that and you know it. You haven't even asked if this poor girl is willing to put up with you. Put up with me? He asked archly. I think she's quite clever enough to see that she'd be well recompensed for putting up with my personality quirks, as you phrased it. Sodai, you spend all your time lurking under Genjutsu and turning up your nose at shinobi just because they can't find you. No one would think to look for a Genjutsu here. Precisely, the cat said with another sharp tail twitch. Therefore, they're unworthy of my time and attention. Nakoto-san pinched the bridge of her nose, then turned to them with a sheepish grin. Sorry. Sodai's a handful. And he's been here for a while, so he's sort of one of our resident characters. We haven't quite figured out why he hadn't given up yet. Shall we look at some dogs? Almost pouring himself to the floor from the top of the cabinet, the cat surprised her when he said, Oh, very well. Lead the way. You're coming? Sakura asked. Of course, the cat said, blinking up at her lazily. And given what followed, it wasn't difficult to discern why. Every dog and puppy had issues with parentage, prowess, and personality laid bare before her until they were all regarding her nervously. Some of the puppies had even taken to running. Judging by the thrumming purr of satisfaction radiating up from the cat at her foot, that was exactly what Sodai had intended. Sakura had never had a natural aptitude for handling strong personalities. Naruto's loudness made her want to smack him upside the head, Sasuke's aggression made her handle him like he was an unstable chemical, and the first few years of her friendship with Aino had been spent in the shadow of a much more self-assertive personality. She was better now than she had been in those early years in the academy, but there was a limit that she hadn't managed to overcome yet. It wasn't a problem in enemy shinobi, she didn't have to make conversation with them. As far as she could tell, Sodai was everything bad that had ever been said about cats. He was clever, conniving, and almost appalling self-centered. And yet, it wasn't just that he'd chosen her. When it came to written work, she'd been unequivocally the best in her class at the academy. When it came to group work, she'd always had people choose her, even when they didn't like her, depending on her skill and work ethic to get them through the assignment. Until the real world, until Wave, she'd had a lot of confidence in that. Only now, months and months later, was she starting to regain that sense of self-worth, but it had never been low enough for that alone to have decided her. Even if he had been waiting all this time for someone to see him, hiding behind that Genjutsu. There was something in that, something that tugged at her, just a little. And that something, combined with clear skill and that cleverness, and conniving that also stood to be so irritating, made up her mind. He didn't struggle as Sakura picked him up, hind legs dangling as she met his eyes. He just blinked at her, docile enough now that he'd gotten his way. Sakura, please don't tell me you choose an arrogant, self-centered cat over a loving, loyal dog, no matter how sleek his fur is, Kakashi-senpai said, then paused. No, wait, he sighed. That question just answered itself. Sorry to have wasted your time, Nekoto-chan. It looks like that one will be going home with us after all. It wasn't just a matter of paperwork, or fees, which Kakashi-senpai handed over, giving Sakura a card from her parents, who'd wished her the best with her new friend, but also a very complex sealing that took place in a purpose-made room. Shallow lines etched into the floor were filled with ink in which their blood, hers and Sudai's, mingled, and it took the assistance of 4 of the workers to see it completed. Sakura didn't feel much different afterward, but Kakashi-senpai reassured her that it wasn't that kind of a seal. Much like actual pets required a collar, personal summons required some signal of their affiliation so as not to be mistaken for a pet by a civilian. Nekoto-san helped her find something like a small version of a shamak. Though young and rather slender, Sodai was fully grown and larger than Pakin, which rather than being knotted was held closed by a metal clip with the leaf engraved on it, which set at an angle, slightly to one side. Judging by the purring that reached her ear from where the cat had draped himself across her shoulders, he found it more than sufficient, but judging by the way Pakin was eyeing him, there would be a definite adjustment period. So long as they didn't live up to the fighting like cats and dogs saying, Sakura thought she could live with that. Vulpophilia. I feel like it's staring at me, Tatsuo remarked as he eyed the mask, which had found a temporary home on the coffee table. I know what you mean, Sakura replied, glancing down at it. I had to take it out of my room. I kept feeling like it might come alive and attack me if I turned my back on it. And forget sleeping with it in a 40-foot radius. I'd almost be afraid to move it, Tatsuo muttered. The mask was Guzin's. Sakura had seen several different animal designs on ANBU masks in the brief moments she spotted them around the city, but she'd never seen one quite like Guzin's. For one, its base color wasn't white but a deep, terrible red, which made its wide, toothy smile all the more gruesome. The old woman had called it a gift, but Sakura only saw it as further confirmation of a terrible sense of humor. Fascinating had been Sudai's pronouncement, which had prefaced the cat laying belly down, staring at the mask for hours on end. Then had come conclusions on color and subtle asymmetry, and the aesthetics of fear and the grotesque, which had been interesting but hadn't really made the fear better. Oh really, the two of you, the cat said impatiently, rising from his seat and vaulting across the divide to the coffee table. Nudging it to one side with his head, he cleared the space enough for Sakura to set down her tray of drinks and snacks. Thanks, So-chan, Sakura said, which made Sudai's tail and whiskers twitch, though with amusement or irritation it was hard to say. Living with So-dai was an experience. One that told her that she'd grown up a little when she wasn't looking, because it wasn't in her anymore to simply comply. But to her surprise, that hadn't thrown So-dai at all. He compromised, most of the time, and simply ignored her when he wasn't willing to. But he never looked like he resented her asserting her own rules. Like the no cats while showering rule. He didn't follow it very well, but he'd only complained when she tried shoving him under the spray rather than throwing him out. And for someone who'd lived basically alone for years, it was very strange to have a warm, furry form curled into her side when she woke up. Or to be woken up by a cat who knew no regular hours prowling the house, or to wake up to sharp little claws kneading at her back. To have someone to talk to over breakfast. To have someone insist that a real breakfast included fish. Without fail. To have someone to talk to at home at all. She understood, in those moments, exactly why Kakashi-senpai needed the Nikken. It had nothing to do with tracking or combat prowess, and everything to do with simple company. With So-dai there was a lot less time for disastrous introspection, and he never failed to wake her from her nightmares. What are we watching? So-dai demanded as Nikken suddenly poured into the room, heralding Kakashi-senpai's arrival. That would depend on what senpai brought from the video rental, Sakura told him. We're being subject to his questionable taste again. So-dai complained, even though he'd already stretched himself across the back of the couch. It is his turn, Tatsuo pointed out. And it's strange, how often my turn seems to coincide with me being away on missions. I start to feel unloved, Kakashi-senpai said from where he surveyed the scene from the doorframe, his Nikken all claiming their favorite spots. Line of sight to the television was irrelevant. The frame rate was too slow for them to perceive it as anything but a slideshow with a soundtrack. The same was even more true of So-dai, but he wasn't content just to keep them company like the Nikken, who were more than happy with an occasional head scratch. No, So-dai required attention. But he wasn't alone in his criticism of Kakashi-senpai's choices. It's not you, senpai, Sakura reassured him. Just your unique taste in movies. Sometimes, because it was Kakashi-senpai, she thought he was doing it on purpose, but also because it was Kakashi-senpai, she couldn't be certain. Can we get one where both the main characters survive? Or at least one that doesn't involve a kiss in the rain? Tatsuo asked wryly. You are both heartless savages, Kakashi-senpai said drolly. Then his gaze caught on the mask, which had ended up facing the door when So-dai had finished nosing it out of the way. And where, exactly, did that come from? It was a gift, Sakura admitted. From who? From someone I know, Sakura settled on at last. That I never would have guessed, Kakashi-senpai retorted. Because that design looks almost like a decommissioned ANBU mask. Sometimes, Sakura forgot that Kakashi-senpai had once been ANBU and that though Guzan-san was now an old woman who passed the time scaring children, she'd once been infamous. Does it? She asked. Chapter 36, Toward Better Days, Part 5. Sakura was clever, competent, and followed orders well, which meant that people genuinely liked working with her. It wasn't like placing his other students, who would have been headaches for very different reasons. She'd built a tidy little reputation before being assigned to Ihara Cho, a chunin who had a reputation of her own. The older chunin had a very low tolerance for recklessness. After what had happened to her first team, one of her teammates had been convinced that despite their sensei's orders he was more than ready to be a part of the war effort and managed to get both himself and Ihara's other squadmate killed when he hadn't been, and he supposed he'd let himself get complacent, let himself trust in Ihara's better cautious than sorry selection of missions. What he'd really wanted to do was shake Ginma until his teeth rattled once he discovered how Sakura had even come into contact with someone like Guzan Reiji. But unfortunately the other jounin had been out on a mission. So he'd settled for ambling toward the little cluster of houses that was essentially an ANBU retirement community. It was a very small community and insular. It took a certain kind of person to survive ANBU as long as most of them had, and being nice wasn't necessarily one of the requisite attributes. He remembered his own stint in ANBU with no particular fondness. Mostly it had been S-rank special ops, high-risk missions run in unallied countries with no support or reinforcements if things went sour. Those hadn't been so bad. They'd been enough to keep his mind on the here and now. But there was a reason that they were called Black Ops. The necessary but ethically and morally dubious ones. Being a shinobi was being asked to sacrifice your body for your country. Being ANBU sometimes felt like selling pieces of your soul for it. At the time he thought that he was so numb to everything it wouldn't make any difference what his body was doing, but it had. It had. Kakashi had been the prodigy of his generation, but he was wise enough to know that there was always someone. Someone better, someone faster, someone deadlier. Uchiha Itachi and before him, Uchiha Madara had made their names famous by being unfathomably dangerous. Namikaze Minato. The Senju Hokage. The third. Those were the heroes of the village. They were the names every genin knew. They'd cast long shadows, and in those shadows lived shinobi whose names never became famous because they'd spent their entire careers behind dehumanizing masks. Especially in the early days of the villages, when it had been spilled blood and piled corpses deciding which villages would survive the chaos, which ones would eventually become the Shinobi Godaikoku, the 5 great shinobi countries. Kakashi redirected his thoughts from their dangerous course, but just at this moment reflecting on Sakura wasn't comfortable either, because it wasn't as if she'd met the woman they called Grandmother Nightmare only a week or 2 ago. She'd known her long enough and well enough that there was a mask in her house that had seen more carnage than most shinobi saw in their entire careers. Somehow, even though he now did such things as movie nights and sparring matches with his former student, he'd managed to forget that Sakura wasn't like the others. She'd smile, play pretend that all was well in her world while internalizing her problems, attempting to solve them on her own. She didn't demand to be taught new techniques, whether through shouting or sulky silence. She'd just taken what little he'd had to give and made do, searching out things on her own. Surprising him, mostly in pleasant ways, but seeing that grinning red visage had shaken him as badly as Sasuke's decision to leave. It ate at him that he hadn't been able to discern the nightmares that had followed her home from those that might have come from whatever she'd been doing with Guzan. Sakura knew who she was, what she'd been, what that mask meant, because otherwise she would have never bothered to deflect that question. His question now was just how far that familiarity went. Kakashi didn't think he'd like the answer. Sakura had been the one without all the inescapable history. If she'd taken up creating her own, he didn't know what he'd do. Except maybe more of the same thing he'd been doing his whole life for the important people in it, showing up too late to do anything but help the odd survivor limp away. And there were so few of those. And then he was at the home of the woman who'd once worn that toothy mask, and there she was, a little old woman sitting on her porch, hands full of a knitting project. He waited, to see if she'd acknowledge him, but there was only the rhythmic clicking of her needles. He cleared his throat. "Nice day, isn't it?" he asked conversationally. "Hataki," Guzan responded reproachfully. "I am an old woman. I don't have enough time left for you to go around wasting it. You're here about Sakura." "Ah, yes," he said, only momentarily discombobulated by her directness. "I noticed a mask the last time I was at her house. Strangely enough, it looked like yours." "Well, I did give it to her," Guzan admitted plainly. "So of course it did. It's hers now, whatever she decides to do with it. Just as with everything else I've given her." He told himself it was impossible because of Guzan's history of hoarding her jutsu, even as his instincts prompted suspicion, but this. "You've always refused to pass on your techniques," he remarked, somehow hoping that she'd agree, that she was referring to recipes, knitting patterns, even a kitschy salt shaker collection. "That's still true," Guzan agreed, and the tension ran out of Kakashi's shoulders, his breath escaping him in a sigh of relief. "I'll take my techniques to my grave. Inherited techniques are dead things. You learn them well, and you think that's all there is to them. It doesn't take genius to refine them, make them your own, to better accommodate and complement your abilities rather than that of its creator. She can go to others for that. But jutsu you develop yourself, there's something living. It's like raising children. No matter how old you get, you're never quite finished. That's something I'll pass on to Sakura. She paused for a moment, and then smiled. Aside from the character-building aspects, it's not in my nature to be so generous as to let someone grow famous on my blood, sweat, and labor. If Sakura masters what I've shown her, it'll be because she's clever enough to do it. Not because she's got those damnable eyes, she murmured sourly, gaze drifting to where a Sharingan lay obscured by cloth and metal. Or because she happened to be born to a family with the right kind of blood, the right kind of history. The tension had returned to his shoulders, creeping up the muscles of his neck and threatening to inspire a headache. Shown her? He repeated with careful neutrality. She came to me with nightmares. I gave her better ones, Guzan replied. She'll need them, if Orochimaru doesn't put down that Uchiha whelp before he's old enough to cause too much trouble. Kakashi bristled slightly, both at the insinuation that Sasuke would make more trouble than he already had for the village and the certainty that Sakura would meet him in battle. Even if she confronted Sasuke, he pointed out, he has the Sharingan. Guzan's lips twisted into a sneer. Even with so many of them dead, you still believe in their myth, don't you? That boy's family made that mistake, thought that those eyes made them gods, but look what that got them. Even if they had been, she said with deep ironic emphasis, even gods can be tricked. And they can die. Epistemophilia. Given Sakura's introduction to Guzan-san, she never asked outright to be taught any techniques. So she memorized what genjutsu could be found in the library, not very many, though a person could drown in theory, and learned all of what Kakashi-senpai had to share. Which wasn't much. He hadn't said so, just implied that he'd always found them incompatible with his personal style. Judging by the way he'd collapsed in wave and what Honda-san had said, using the Sharingan was almost as taxing to him as using the Byakugan was to Tatsuo, albeit less painful. Not many ninja made use of genjutsu anyway. When they'd bothered Kakashi-senpai simply hadn't judged them worth the chakra to collect. So she'd focused on other things. Perhaps not easier, because if they were easy, wouldn't everyone be capable of chakra-augmented strength or medical jutsu? Poisons were easier than those, because other people used them and because they'd fought a war with Suna. There were dosage tables, endless suggestions on sourcing them, using them, enhancing them. And suddenly, or it seemed sudden, she had preferences, field experience, recognized expertise. But she dared, on a morning she was feeling miserable and worn and achy with the newfound nastiness that was the dark side of puberty, to do more than just dismiss the illusion of stinging red ants boiling up out of the ground. This time she struck back, hiding her hand signs in the loose dirt she was working in. Mugen, Jibaku Satsu. She felt the pull on her chakra and saw the ghost form, the tree nearest Guzan-san reaching out to embrace her with deadly intent, Sakura's own body given the illusion of invisibility. It was an old illusion, almost traditional, really, popular among Konohanin because it made use of their native environment. More chakra-intensive than she liked, the complex, constantly shifting camouflaging illusion that was the invisibility component was hugely draining, but it was bound up in the technique. She thought it was pretty good, the lines of the ghost firm and solid, her execution seamless, but Guzan-san only snorted and reached out, her hand parting the illusion like water. And just like that, it faded away. Come here, girl, Guzan-san said, beckoning her over. With more than a little trepidation, Sakura did as she was told. Your hand, Guzan-san said impatiently when she'd reached her. Bemused, Sakura extended it. Strong fingers, hard and bony, snatched her wrist, and before she could do more than widen her eyes in surprise, she'd scraped Sakura's hand along the bark of the tree so hard that there were droplets of blood forming up on the stinging skin. These canned illusions, Guzan-san said with distaste. They make you lazy. You make some signs and trust it to take care of all the details. It's not like that evocative genjutsu that you favor. That reaches into your victim's mind and tears out the image you need. They're providing all the details, you're simply providing guidance and chakra. Invocative genjutsu are all about the details. I've told you that before, but it doesn't seem to have sunk in. If I can't feel the texture of the bark rasping against my clothes and my skin when the branches are closing, if I can't hear the creaking and groaning of the wood as it moves, if I can't smell the bark and the lichen. If the pressure feels like a flat iron band rather than a rounded limb, you're doing it wrong, she remarked flatly. You're not dealing in illusions, Guzan-san continued, never releasing her hold on Sakura's arm, leaving those droplets to become slowly drying rivulets. The world is experienced through the senses. All we know of the world is perception. You have to make it real. You're not peddling dreams to your target, you're changing their world. All the way down to the fragments of bark left behind in a scrape. She emphasized her point by sweeping her thumb over Sakura's red skin, making her wince. You have to create a situation in which to disbelieve your genjutsu is to disbelieve all of your senses. You've had nightmares for as long as I've known you. How hard is it to tell yourself it's only a dream while you're living it? But you have to do better than that. The mind tricks itself while it dreams. It knows what details it needs, but you won't have that advantage when you turn a genjutsu on someone else. Humans give sight primacy, but it's not the only thing that matters. With enough chakra, you can overwhelm the shortcomings of a genjutsu, but it's ugly. Beneath you. Anyone with enough chakra can do it, like beating someone over the head with a cudgel until they agree with you that the sky is green. You're too weak for that in terms of chakra, too skilled for that in terms of potential. Their ways isn't yours. You can't replicate fire by simply looking at it. If you have to burn your hand 100 times to truly experience it, then that's what you do. Do you understand? Sakura nodded weakly. Now try again. Guzan-san was endlessly critical and apt to interrupt Sakura's focus by turning her own genjutsu against her and giving it teeth. Guzan had nothing but scorn for using the illusions without understanding how they were created, the way most shinobi utilized genjutsu. Without that basic knowledge, they could not modify them, let alone create them freely the way that Guzan-san seemed to. It wasn't that Sakura didn't have the knowledge, precisely. Sakura had an excellent grounding in theory, buttressed by a solid medical understanding of how and why genjutsu fed false signals back to the brain. But creating new jutsu? That wasn't something they were taught at the academy, or something that was expected of Chunin. Especially as Guzan-san seemed to insinuate that, with the right technique, all invocative genjutsu were one. Not one jutsu for ants, another for spiders, another for fire, just one, ultimately flexible technique that allowed one to project nightmares limited only by your imagination. Though, she admitted, having a dozen or so scenarios you had so perfectly memorized they were instinctive was useful. And every evocative genjutsu required its own technique. Though Guzan-san pointed out, it wasn't only nightmares that could be useful even if she enjoyed them most. Tranquility. Joy. Desire. All of it could be manipulated, twisted to serve a purpose, and for the first time Sakura thought it was a good thing that Guzan-san dealt in fear. The thought of being confronted by illusions meant to evoke desire at every turn. Well, the spiders with their clicking mandibles and hairy legs were finally preferable to something. But the others, the call of a familiar voice, the scent of a summer's day, the feel of home, all of it could become tiny, fatal distractions. She worked with the Magen, Jabakasatsu, breaking it into its component pieces until she was only working with an illusionary tree. Sakura tried working with it as the ghost and found it too intangible. Consultation with Guzan-san returned the fact that, yes, you could turn a genjutsu on yourself. She hadn't liked the beneficent look that had accompanied the answer, but it hadn't taken long to work out that genjutsu stood to be the ultimate drug. You could see anything, feel anything, be anything so long as your chakra held out. All Sakura wanted was to master it, so she spent hours with one palm pressed against the real tree, the other against its mirror. And she kept at it until only her memory and the tug on her chakra were the only indicators as to which was the original. It was only the first piece of an endless puzzle, the world transformed into a place not to be just experienced, but painstakingly memorized. As Guzan-san had promised, the things she feared came easiest, almost imprinting themselves on her memory as she bit down on one hand and tried to keep the other from trembling as she allowed things with too many legs and poisonous glands to crawl across the back of it. Instead of just ignoring pain, working through it, she carefully committed the feel of a cut, the agony of a burn, the ache of a blow. Other, more pleasant things took on a new intensity as she captured not just impressions in passing, but lingered until she knew the exact texture of a petal, the feel of silk, the scent of a home-cooked meal. She put together scenarios with painstaking care, until she could call them up with only the hand signs and a moment's attention. And one of Guzan-san's friends, he lived 2 houses over, with a garden full of lilies and a closet full of skeletons, like all the XANBU, introduced her to his son, who was a TNI specialist. It was from him that she learned what there was to know about evocative Genjutsu, dredging up treasured and dreaded memories both from the depths of an enemy's subconscious. It took her more than a year until she'd grown confident enough in her collection to call it a technique. Guzan-san never once disclosed what she'd called hers, and Sakura had never named anything. Not her knives, not her cat. But she called this kanashibari, that awful moment when waking from a nightmare in which one found oneself paralyzed, unable to move or speak. Erythrophilia. Sakura was all but basking the warmth of the day, which was why she was comfortably settled against a tree in one of the parks within Konoha rather than reading at home. Sodai had accompanied her, but he melted into a furry puddle in a dappled patch of sunlight almost immediately on arrival. He wasn't usually content to sleep, even when she'd rather he did, so the sight of him stretched out on the grass had prompted a wry, fond grin. Then she turned her attention to her book and set the world and all its worries aside for a while. She had her own customer loyalty card at Lemon and Lime and, to her embarrassment, was as well known for her tastes as Kakashi-senpai was for his. She'd once tried about the first 3 chapters of the first Ika novel, but that had been enough to know that it was written by a man for men, which was fine, she guessed, but not something she'd read voluntarily. She'd found her own niche genres. Another femdom light? Or is it an empowered reverse harem heroine today? Was Akemi-chan's familiar, teasing refrain. Sakura had read and reread all the Tsunami to Tsunderaku novels, so until the next one came out, she was searching out new authors. None had quite measured up to Tsunami, but she'd found others she liked. This one, safely hidden behind the barrier of a medical text to allow for public reading, was a new recommendation from Akemi-chan, who worked at the store to facilitate a ferocious reading habit that appreciated the employee discount and the ability to read book blurbs on her breaks. Kangaraguru was the first of another multi-book series, this one featuring an embittered jounin trap master who'd been badly injured both physically and mentally when her lover/partner, who'd been a habitual piece of nastiness who'd undermined her confidence in herself as a person. Though he hadn't been able to touch her confidence as a shinobi, had betrayed her. She was therefore none too receptive to the attentions of her gentle Hyuga Medicnine, whose goal had become to restore both her health and her heart despite Beniko's somewhat acidic personality. With a combination of some sort of Jukin-derived chakra massage that had started as physiotherapy and quickly become quasi-erotic, and Beniko's practical skills at restraining enemies used in ways that Sakura wasn't certain she was quite comfortable with, but Hyuga Jinichi seemed to enjoy, she was treading ground very strange to her. Tsunami had been easy to emphasize with. Beniko was a little harder to understand when she was touched by the trust displayed in Jinichi's easy submission. She was on a page with an illustrated plate, and was trying very hard not to glance over at the art, and that looked like a seriously complex series of knots, and she was trying hard not to remember that there was an appendix to this novel that had directions, and if it was this bad before any actual sex, Sakura didn't know if she'd survive the later novels. Hen, she heard raucous laughter. Looking up in guilty instinct, she found Tenten almost sobbing with laughter against Niji's shoulder. Lee just looked bemused, but Niji looked very close to spontaneous combustion. And he was looking at her. Tenten raised her head, wiping tears from her eyes, and seeing that Sakura was looking at them, stepped towards her. Sakura managed to shove both her books into her messenger bag before she was very close, but the knowing grin on her face told her she was fooling no one except maybe Lee. Something wrong, Tenten? She asked. Not really, Tenten replied, the grin widening. You must have been pretty into that book. Sakura did not rise to the bait, willing down the flush that wanted to color her cheeks and set the tips of her ears to burning. Tenten didn't seem disappointed. Guy-sensei was just with us, she said. He happened to see you here, studying in the park, and held you up as an example of youth and virtue to us all. Her expression turned positively wicked. Only it looked to me like you were enjoying it just a little too much, you know. So I coerced poor Niji into taking a look at what you were reading. One look at his face and it was pretty easy to tell that wasn't a medical textbook. Care to share? Sakura's eyes darted over toward Niji, who was all but gaping at her. She shushed the terrible, inquiring part of her brain that wanted to ask if Juken could even be used like that and settled instead for being embarrassed, and feeling it served her right for following Kakashi-senpai's example. Trichophilia. Sakura gained some things and lost others when her team left. Tatsuo was one of them. No one except Ino had brushed her hair for her since her grandmother died, and it had never occurred to her to want anyone to. But they'd both seen the movie before and she was multitasking from the floor in front of the couch, taking notes, as she read over a new study on abnormalities in the eye that could cause debilitating symptoms when chakra was used to enhance them. The stabbing pain hadn't improved with practice. When she enhanced her eyes for shunshin for long periods, she began to feel first pain, then a gradual loss of color vision, and just the other day she'd scared herself when vision in her left eye had degraded to foggy shadows. She'd eventually come to suspect that she might be only very slightly astigmatic, which didn't affect her day-to-day vision, but when amplified by chakra to force her eyes to process visual stimuli at a rate humans weren't normally capable of, she exacerbated it into optic neuritis due to spillover from her channels. While it wasn't really pleasant, especially if she permanently blinded herself before she corrected it, she'd taken it as an opportunity. She had a feeling that Tatsuo's vision problems, while more extreme, might be linked to the same damage caused by chakra spillover from damaged paths. By insisting on correcting her own vision issues herself, rather than confessing the problem to a proper medic, she also provided a neat excuse for the borrowed books that littered her room without making any promises she might not be able to keep. Before they'd settled in for movie night tonight, Sakura and Tatsuo had engaged in a long, grueling practice session that pitted her ability to dodge against his Juken, so she'd showered as soon as she'd made it home and left her hair loose to air dry while Tatsuo took his own turn in the shower. She was regretting that now, as every time she leaned forward her hair spilled over her shoulders, getting in the way and leaving wet tracks on the paper. Sakura scowled at it, having worn it tied back so long she'd forgotten the irritation of wearing it loose for anything but going straight to bed. She'd started growing it out for Sasuke, even though its texture meant that it would never be as smooth and sleek as she'd like it to be. Not like Ino's. She'd kept growing it out of habit, and because another few inches of ponytail was as easy to wrap as doing the rest of it. It also made her feel pretty, perhaps a little more feminine, which mattered sometimes. Not in the field, but at home, out with friends. Mariko had been proven right in her predictions. With some new height and her morning walks, she had fantastic legs, now that she was developing the hips to complement them. But her bust was, well, a bust. And despite the pleasant implications of that later in life, no back problems or fear of the inevitability of gravity, it was in the now a sore spot that wasn't soothed by the fact that she wasn't nearly old enough to have her full growth in any way just yet. Shoving her hair back over her shoulders, only to have it fall forward once more, Sakura glared at Tatsuo when he chuckled. "Hold that thought," he said, disappearing upstairs only to return with comb and brush in hand. Settling himself on the floor with his back supported by the couch, he shoved the coffee table to one side until there was room enough for Sakura to settle herself in front of him. It wasn't until he'd worked the tangles out that she noticed what an unexpectedly sensual activity it was, the firm, even stroke of the brush across her scalp, his fingers deftly managing the length of her hair. She went very tense and still, suddenly aware of Tatsuo in a way she usually wasn't. She spent her days with him, bunked with him on missions, sparred with him, and fought beside him. She was more comfortable with him than she'd ever been with another person, but in this moment comfortable was not what she was feeling. Tatsuo was her partner. A person way before he was a young man. Not now. Not with the warm heat of him so close, his woodsy, musky scent tickling her nose. She almost yelped when he nudged her in the ribs with his knees. "Relax," he admonished her. "How?" she demanded plaintively in her head, but over her sudden discomfort, she reminded herself just who it was at her back. And with that, it was easier to disperse her tension by folding her legs tight against her chest, tucking her arms securely around them. The movement turned her back into a sensitive curve and she shivered as the thin fabric of her t-shirt provided little protection against the gentle stroking that was chasing pleasant sensations down her spine. Tatsuo kept it up until she'd been lulled into a pleasant drowsiness, which was why she made a sound of protest when the brushing stopped. There came his soft chuckle again, then an insistent tugging sensation. "What are you doing?" Sakura murmured. "Your hair," Tatsuo replied teasingly. "Now, hold still or it'll be uneven." Sakura did as she was told, until he draped her hair forward over her shoulder. "When and why exactly did you learn how to do a fishbone braid?" she asked bemusedly, though she had to admire what a neat job he'd done of it. "Trade secret," was his reply. "Not bad, though." "No, it's really good," Sakura reassured him. "Thanks," she said shyly, twisting around to glance at him. Hyuga's eyes had once looked very strange to her, like the milky eyes of dead fish when she was at her most unkind, but she could read good humor, kindness, warmth in them now. And something more than warmth, something like heat, an expression she had little experience interpreting but which spoke to deep instincts. She'd known from the moment that she met Tatsuo that he was good-looking, but it had never felt so immediate and visceral as in this moment. And all those things tugged at her, made her realize all of a sudden that she was very lucky to be this close to him, to have met him at all. There'd only been one other moment when she'd been so aware of someone else, but that moment with Zen had only been an instant, not this slow, languid build towards something. It also sparked another thought. What would it be like to kiss a friend, instead of a stranger? To kiss Tatsuo? There was something in the moment that prevented her from weighing good idea against bad idea, from considering consequences, more curiosity and the heady sense of being admired driving her rather than outright desire. She twisted around to face him fully, flexible as a cat, her hands pressed flat against the floor on either side of his hips. She caught a flash of Tatsuo's widening eyes in her peripheral vision, but she was intent on getting the angle just so, because she wasn't so long in the moment as to be immune to the embarrassment of messing this up. Her first contact was gentle, tentative, her lips barely whispering over his, but when she drew back a little to regroup, she shifted all her weight onto one hand so that she could slip the other behind his neck, committing more of herself to the motion. Their second kiss was longer, more reciprocal as he shifted, his hands coming up to grasp her shoulders. Sakura felt the sting of both embarrassment and disappointment as he gently put space between them, which spurred her to duck her head and try to make a dignified retreat. But he held her fast, one hand leaving her shoulder to nudge her chin up until she met his eyes. "To be clear," he said, "this isn't no, but my temperament isn't suited for doing something like this for curiosity's sake. I've had to let go of too many things already to keep doing it with grace. You're a wonderful partner and very pretty, but you haven't had enough people tell you that yet. When you make jounin," he silenced her automatic protest at that, "when you make jounin and you've left enough men breathless, if you still want a Hyuga whose eyes are so thoroughly ruined the elders removed his kago no tori no join, we can do this again. I promise I'll be waiting." Gamophobia. Sakura gained some things and lost others when her team left. Tatsuo was one of them. He'd given her time and a choice, but as she gripped his sunglasses like her hold on them was the only thing keeping her world intact. One lens cracked, both smeared with blood. She understood that was a choice she'd never have to make. There was a strange numbness in her, uncurling from her belly, up her spine, into those hands that weren't shaking from the fear and grief and rage. They'd been contracted for a kidnapping. Wealthy merchant's daughter who'd been traveling incognito. He'd been unwilling to wait for a ransom note, had been quick to commission a B-rank that had a Harataishu's entire squad on the trail. It had led them to a little town on the coast, which had been unexpected but not entirely strange. Urban environments offered more anonymity, but they'd expected to eventually discover an isolated farmhouse or something similar, an environment where you could hold someone captive without anyone raising a fuss. As it turned out, none of the captor's neighbors would have done more than recommend a buyer. They'd stumbled onto a generations-entrenched slaving operation, reinforced by missing Nin talent. Jounin-level talent. Not many, but it only took one. Just one to see beneath the henge and decide a Hyuga was too much of a threat to their operation to leave the village alive. It had all gone wrong, so quickly. They hadn't known what they'd happened upon, weren't given the chance to form conclusions. They'd gone in together, because that was what partners did, because that was what their orders were, 2 others to make up a full squad, Tatsuo their face in the crowd, their infiltrator. Sakura's transformation jutsu were flawless, but he had a touch with people that she didn't, so she'd always interacted less directly on these kinds of missions, kept an eye on the place, the people, her partner. In a town this size, this had taken the form of shadowing him in a way that civilians wouldn't normally have noticed. But they weren't civilians. And if Tatsuo's reflexes had been any less honed, he'd have been dead when the first missing need struck. One of their squad had gone for help, the other had gone to reinforce Tatsuo's position, and Sakura yanked both canisters her tear gas solution from her vest as people spilled into the street like a disturbed hive of hornets. Some part of her had acknowledged that this was it then, the place where it ended, because retreat was the only certain path out of this place. She was fast enough to outrun them all. But not fast enough to leave Tatsuo behind, not when she could see him at the end of the street. Despite the quickness of the residents' response, there was a distinct lack of military precision in the armed chaos below. Her initial impression was correct. Like bees or ants, they were only following the first to strike, mindlessly operating to eliminate the threat in their midst before carrying on with their lives. Some of them were hardly more than ordinary people wielding whatever was at hand, grass sickles and butcher knives, protecting a livelihood. She'd already been wearing her combat glasses, her shimok pulled snug across the bridge of her nose, so there was no hesitation as she pitched the canisters into the thick of the crowd. She was in this moment immune to the gradations of guilt and culpability. If it was within reach of her knives and carried or had carried a weapon, it didn't matter if it screamed, cried, or tried to flee, she cut them down. Men, women, half-grown children. It was like the crowd on the end of the bridge all over again, except this time she was Zabuza, and it was a slaughter. Between the gas and the whirlwind the slavers were reaping, Sakura had enough space to maneuver without the press of bodies overwhelming her with sheer numbers. But not enough of them were fleeing and too many of them were capable of using chakra to keep the roof paths from being an advantage. She was briefly, fiercely jealous of anyone who could have used a ninjutsu to turn the streets into a graveyard in one massive expenditure of chakra. But even if she killed herself with the effort, Sakura couldn't have done it, so she didn't waste the energy, let it fall away because the world outside demanded all her attention. Everything was the flash of steel under sunlight, the subtle shift to avoid an oncoming blow, the strain on her wrists, as she swept her blades through flesh and cloth and sometimes bone. She was such a part of the rhythm of this terrible, mad dance she almost didn't realize she'd fought her way to Tatsuo's side. But there he was, those graceful killing hands lashing out with a quickness that would have been impossible to follow if she wasn't seeing the world with eyes enhanced with chakra. Their styles were a good match for fighting side by side, either of them used ninjutsu, each had a precision, an economy to their movements. The third member of their squad was there too, tried to lead them out of the carnage, but the moment he made the rooftops more skilled missing Nin targeted him. He was like the rest of a Harataisha's squad, Chunin, more than competent enough when the mission only went sideways, but in these circumstances, against these odds it was only a matter of how many he cut down before he fell himself. Sakura heard shouting when she saw him go down in her peripheral vision, realized that the full squad had arrived. Some part of her fluttered in gratitude, the rest thought that they were here to die, that the right decision would have been to retreat, to report to the village and let them send in a team capable of taking this on. Would she have made the same call? She wasn't given time to reflect on it, just to keep killing, having to keep moving because footwork was becoming difficult around the bodies. Her head began to hurt, her arms began to ache, and she was bleeding from a half-dozen grazes she'd been too slow to avoid. It would only get worse, she registered dimly, as she grew more tired and the real shinobi stepped from behind their meat shields to take down their exhausted prey. It was good tactics, if you had them stomach for them, and it wasn't you being harried into the ground. It was a challenge to pace herself, to not roar aloud and throw herself against them with everything she had, but that was the road to a quick death, and she was determined if she could not live, she would make them pay for it. The thin, cowardly voice in her mind told her that she could still make it if she ran now. This dross, those jounin, none of them could catch her with her speed. She could take Tatsuo with her, could have tried it in the beginning, but she'd never have been able to take their squad of 4 out of harm's way. Even more impossible now, so she shoved it aside with a snarl as she drove her knife up into the hollow of a woman's throat, through the roof of her mouth and further to where the important things dwelled. It was as she was yanking her knife free of her sagging body that something caught her attention. She half-turned, just in time so see Tatsuo sinking to his knees. It was a quiet, suspended moment, where it seemed like all the sound in the world retreated, leaving her in almost perfect silence in which to watch him fall. The veins around his eyes were bulging. He'd used the Byakugan in the end, perhaps brought about his own death with the pain of it. He didn't look afraid, or angry, just wore that intensely focused look he put on instead of admitting how much his eyes hurt him. For a heartbeat, she held out the hope that he'd get up, but then he turned painfully towards her and his neck was all meat and blood where his opponent's Suntetsu had ripped a gaping path. All Sakura's careful pacing suddenly became meaningless. Roughly thrust kicking an opponent away from her with chakra-enhanced strength, feeling the give of his sternum, she was at Tatsuo's side in an instant, sheathing her knives and laying on desperate, useless hands. He was gone and it was with sharp, sour hate that she looked up at his opponent, who gave her a wicked smile and licked Tatsuo's blood from the sharpened points of his Suntetsu, one hand beckoning her in an invitation. How sweet, he cooed insincerely. Well, I'm certain he'd be glad to know you cared. Sakura knitted her fingers, forgetting any reservation she might have had about what it was to fight to kill and fighting to hurt. Show me what you love, Sakura snarled as she manipulated her chakra, sinking intangible claws deep in her target's nervous system. Let me return the favor and take it away. It was evocative Genjutsu, realizing all his deeply buried fears in terrifying detail, like the novel version of the flash fiction that was Kakashi-senpai's hell viewing. Genjutsu could be like dreams, complex ideas conveyed in very brief amounts of time, nightmares writ complete at the speed of thought. She couldn't enjoy the ghost, had to keep fighting, keep killing or be killed, but she could feel a pitiless satisfaction when he began to beg. And she let him beg and scream and cry, caught in her Genjutsu, until she laid bare hands over his throat and pressed with her thumbs until the cartilage of his trachea collapsed and he turned first red, then plum purple, then dead. Breaking things, bones, people, she returned to Tatsuo's side, snatched up his broken sunglasses, closed his eyes for the last time. No time to do more than that. And then she did what she hadn't allowed herself to do before, threw herself into it with a roar until she almost couldn't draw enough breath, almost couldn't lift her arms for the next blow. She took shelter for a little while then, fingering his sunglasses, feeling the growing numbness that settled in her belly. Her vision was already off-color, blurry, and the pain in her head was almost as bad as the pain where someone had driven a curved sickle into her hip almost to the joint. She couldn't do anything about the former, but she could and did seal the worst of her wounds, leaving only a faint, residual stiffness. Sakura slowly rose to her feet, took a shaky breath. I don't want to die. That wasn't a revelation. There was nothing new about that instinct toward survival that made animals gnaw off their own feet in traps to limp through another day, that made people get out of bed in the morning even when there wasn't anything to look forward to. It had been the mantra that had seen her through Gato, through Orochimaru, but sometimes what wasn't enough to change the world. But she stepped back out into the sun anyway, fought until the world faded to shadows and her unblemished knife, never meant to be used with chakra-enhanced strength, broke off midway down the blade. She tossed it aside and buried her fist in someone's face, turning the curve of it concave as the skull collapsed under the force of it. And when she couldn't see anything, was reduced to lashing out blindly, she put her back against the wall and kept at it until someone's hand, huge, sweaty palm, calloused and hard, smashed her head against the wall. Her world exploded in white pain, the hand took a firmer grip, and then she knew nothing at all. Chapter 37, Toward Better Days, Final Part. Kakashi stared blankly down at his open novel, more to have somewhere to focus his gaze that wasn't there than with any real intention of reading it. All of his attention was on the reassuring noise of the medical machinery crouched in every corner of the room, confirming with every dispassionate beep that Sakura had made it through another terrible, silent interval. He owed every one of those seconds to Ihara, who never left the village without a way to contact the network of extraction squads which were based throughout the country for rapid response. In this case, that response had come too late for most of her team. Upon the extraction squad's entry into the village, Because of the nature of the distress call, several teams had rendezvoused before their assault. Only 5 survivors had been discovered, one of whom had lost too much blood to stabilize, another succumbing quietly to shock during transport. The former of those had been part of a pair of ninja that Ehara had ordered to retreat, because she hadn't judged their combat skills adequate enough to pit against such numbers. They'd initially counted Sakura among the dead. If they hadn't had an extremely gifted medic Nin along, or if Sakura had been any less tenacious, she would have remained there. Judging by the extensive bruising, the swelling of her brain and the lovely hematoma that went with it, as well as the broken ribs and the slow hemorrhage that were competing with the traumatic brain injury to kill her first. The responding medic Nin had assessed that someone had bashed her head against a wall until she'd lost consciousness, and kept kicking her once she was down. The slavers hadn't been interested in keeping Sakura. Not with the devastating past she'd left behind her, dozens of corpses bearing the distinctive marks of her knives. Not carnage, because that wasn't Sakura's style, which was all surgical precision and brutal efficiency. Even now that she had stamina to spare, she'd never lost the habits formed when she'd first gotten serious about being a shinobi. He could still remember those days, when a brief sparring match would have her wheezing. Part of him wished they were still living them, that his team had had time to actually be a team, before 2 of them had went off with San Nin, and 1 had taken up desperate last stands. One death had been especially interesting to the captain of the combined extraction squads. A Jounin missing Nin, not famous enough to be a household name, but annoying enough to earn himself a bounty, who'd apparently let himself be strangled by a small pair of hands, no other bruising or marks of restraint on his body at all. Kakashi had hemmed and hawed and avoided admitting that his former student was the present protege of Guzen Reiji, or at least as close as that old bitch would ever come, though he didn't know if giving her the idea that Sakura had crafted a genjutsu capable of holding a jounin without any outside input at all was any better. If it came down to it, he wasn't certain how he felt about it himself. Proud, yes, relieved that Sakura had survived to come back to him when so many hadn't ever come home again. But there was a distinct line between the kind of thoughtless, childish cruelty that she'd displayed on occasion with Naruto and the kind of cruelty, or at least the level of dissociation, the lack of empathy, or perhaps the will strong enough to overcome any sympathy, that was required to use Guzen's brand of genjutsu. It was always possible that Sakura had used something else, something a little less like the reason so many genjutsu types of any reputation tended to be infamous. But Kakashi had gotten into the habit of assuming the worst and being proved right. And he was no stranger to bitter anger, but he never had the ability to express it as someone else's nightmares. Not the way a proper genjutsu specialist could. The technique he'd shown Sakura, that was a bludgeon, no build-up or subtlety at all, easily escaped by a halfway competent shinobi. Not enough to hold a jounin for more than a few seconds, certainly not long enough to strangle anyone. Over 2 years ago now, Sakura had made her first kill and that had changed her irrevocably. This would do the same, but only time would tell how this whole miserable situation would change her. He could only be there, offer what support he could, even if it was just repressing his dislike of hospitals to sit at her bedside and watch over her while she slept. It wasn't the obligation of a sensei to his student. He hadn't even been that in name for a long time. It was the same kind of warm regard he might have felt for a younger sister, if he'd ever had one. Despite the disparity between their ages and experience, Sakura was a friend. And he had precious few of those, none of whom made him break his rules as easily or readily as Sakura. She was Pack, the family that he'd chosen and been chosen by. So despite the antiseptic smell that turned his stomach, Kakashi stayed. The mundane matters were being taken care of by others, so that he could be there when Sakura woke. Any kills conclusively identified as Sakura's that carried a bounty had already been processed and the funds deposited in her account, the bounties which belonged to deceased shinobi having been given to their families alongside the death settlement. In this case, the bodies of all the Konoha shinobi had been successfully retrieved, so there had been that closure. Genma, who delivered an absolutely riotous bouquet, was feeding both the Niken and Sakura's furry terror. The Niken, at least, were capable of reacting with sufficient gravity, curling in miserable little piles around Sakura's bed when they'd come to visit. But the cat had planted himself on Sakura's sternum and started kneading his claws in her blanket, those uncanny eyes focused on her face as if he was either gauging her expression or demanding she wake and pay attention to him. Kakashi had removed him by the scruff of his neck, and the cat had taken sulkily to second-guessing the nurses. Kakashi glanced up as someone slid the door open, and he was surprised to see it was Ehara. "Should you be up?" he asked, taking in her sallow skin and a mouth turned into a thin, tightly compressed line by her refusal to admit to pain. "I'm well enough to look over what's left of my team," she replied as she walked stiffly to Sakura's bedside. She was silent for a long time, then without looking over at him, she said, "I'm recommending her for promotion. Even if they don't make her jounin, she's ready to lead a team. I was going to wait until she got over whatever she has against elemental ninjutsu, but I see now that she doesn't need it. It'd be useful, of course, but she has the mentality and the skills." "When?" he asked quietly. Now she glanced over at him, her eyes cold and knowing. "I turned the paperwork over to a courier this morning. That's the way this village works. You survive something that could be reasonably expected to break a civilian for the rest of their life, and it asks you to do it on a regular basis. It won't be easy. But it will be a damn sight easier for her if she has something better to do with herself than wallowing in what she lost. She would have been reassigned regardless. Not enough of us survived for this squad to be a viable unit any longer. I'm just making certain she gets the acknowledgement she deserves." Her expression softened, but just slightly, just enough for Kakashi to get a clear sense that for all her detached mien, Ehara was suffering. "She made me proud to be her captain. Right until the end, she never stopped fighting." Having apparently satisfied her need to check up on Sakura and having said her piece, Ehara took her leave and left Kakashi to his vigil, which was interrupted by the parents of her partner, his mother bearing an armful of peonies as pink as Sakura's hair, still tightly furled. Though he'd heard about them, this was his first time meeting them, which made the greeting exchange between them stilted and awkward, Tatsuo's mother escaping the tension by arranging her flowers on the table beneath the window. "I cut them from my garden," she said as she arranged them prettily, all effortless elegance next to Gemna's riot of color. She ran the petals between her thumb and forefinger, looking the kind of reflective that would have been a prelude to tears if it weren't for stalwart Hyuga dignity. Kakashi was grateful for that, because there was nothing in the world to make you feel gawky and awkward like someone crying. Sakura admired them so much when they bloomed last year, so I thought it would be a pity if she missed them this year. I offered to part them out, so she could have her own, but she just gave me this look. She trailed off, letting her hand fall away. She swallowed uncomfortably, and her husband took up the thread of the conversation. "We'll be by again when she's awake." Just because. And it was his turn for that moment when the muscles in his face tensed as he forced emotion down, mastering himself. Just because Tatsuo isn't here any longer doesn't give her an excuse not to visit. For us, for Shinobi, the squad is your family, and just because you lose a member of it doesn't mean you stop being family. The dead never really leave us. "I know," Kakashi replied. And he did. His whole life was full of ghosts. But Sakura wasn't one of them, not yet, and so he stayed until she woke up, stayed while she cried, and promised himself this time, with this team, even if parts of it were scattered, it would be different. The things that don't kill you. Sakura locked the door carefully behind her, sinking to the floor with her back against the comforting solidity of it. Staring blankly at the ceiling, she tried to swallow down the sick feeling creeping up from her belly, the growing certainty that she could not do this. When her breathing was as steady as it was going to get, which was really just a generous way of saying she wasn't lightheaded from the panicked wheezing that had started from the moment she'd resolved to do this, she let her head drop to stare at her hands, flexing them as green medical chakra played like living fire across her fingertips. "This is a bad idea," a little voice warned. "You shouldn't be trying this without supervision. You shouldn't be trying this at all." Before that timid, cautious voice could talk her out of this, Sakura raised her hands to her eyes and began. Eventually she heard Sodai, yowling on the other side of the door. "Sakura? Sakura, what are you doing in there? Answer me." But Sakura couldn't move, couldn't stop, for fear that her microscopic adjustments to the interior of her eye would leave her permanently blind when she opened them again. Delicate muscles, minuscule veins, some of the most fragile chakra channels in the whole body, and she was manipulating them without ever breaking the skin, working only through excellent memory and a strange kind of sonar peculiar to medical chakra. She could hear claws tearing at the door and Sodai snarling, but she ignored him. Sakura, let me in. Let me in. If you don't answer, I'm going to do something drastic. Sakura could only answer with silence, and he finally said, Fine, you irritating creature. If I'd been born with hands, I would rip open this door and strangle you until you came to your senses. But things being as they are, I'm off to summon Kakashi. She could hardly redouble her efforts, because medical chakra just didn't work like that, but she kept panic at bay and finished what she'd started. By the time it was Kakashi knocking on the door, she moved to the far wall, her head held in her hands, too afraid to open her eyes and see what she'd done. Sakura? Kakashi asked cautiously as she heard the knob turn and the door open. Sakura, he said again, his voice closer to her now as he knelt. Sakura, what's wrong? What's wrong? Tsunade-sama said sternly as she brought a clipboard none too gently down atop Sakura's head, is that you have a shinobi with entirely too much talent. Your eyes are fine. Better than fine. Don't think I didn't notice the little improvements, like those shunts you burned into your chakra circulatory system to avoid inflammation caused by chakra spillover. She told Sakura, who winced when it seemed the clipboard would impact again. But instead it came down softly on her hair. Good job, kid. You could cycle chakra into your eyes all the livelong day if it suited you. Keeping the clipboard in place, Tsunade-sama frowned down at her, contemplatively, which was not as reassuring as it might have been. Taki, take a walk, she ordered brusquely. Hokage-sama? Kakashi-senpai queried, his one visible brow rising. You heard me. Take a walk. A long one, well off hospital grounds. I'll see to her discharge, and you can scold her yourself later. Now, shoo. And without another word, Kakashi-senpai went. Tsunade-sama sighed and slumped into the chair beside Sakura's bed. Good. Now we're going to have a talk. No, don't make that face. I'm not going to yell at you. You clearly knew what you were doing and took a calculated risk. That's not something a good commander discourages. In fact, she chuckled, it almost makes me wish that I'd had a hand in it. But in a way it's good that I didn't. What do you mean? Sakura asked. Because I'm a senju, which means I'm bound by all the old agreements. As my student, you would have been a senju by extension, so far as the clans are concerned. You, however, are free to do as you please. And you have someone close to you who is slowly going blind, if chakra exhaustion doesn't manage to kill him first. You mean? Yes, him. He won't like it very much if you try to help, but feel free to ignore his opinions. We have enough suffering in this world without people choosing it, she told her, abruptly shoving herself to her feet. I look forward to our interview, Harino. Interview? Sakura asked blankly. For your Jounin assessment. I'll tell them on my way out that you're cleared to leave. Judging by your records, you'll be able to take care of your own paperwork. And just like that, she made to stride from the room, only turning back when she was in the doorframe. Oh, and Harino? Yes, Tsunade-sama? The secret to a really good impact crater? It's not just pure chakra. It's a simultaneous Doton manipulation. Picnics with the dead. When you're ready, we'll take you to the Hyuga shrine. We parted out some of Tatsuo's ashes for you during the bunkatsu. You'll always be welcome here. 49 days. The time it took a soul to sever all ties with the world. And though she wasn't ready, time for her to say goodbye properly. There was a cultivated peacefulness to the garden, a sense of removed despite its location within the Hyuga compound. There were high whitewashed walls which buffered the sound of people and intensified the impression of being alone with the dead. One enormous memorial stone dominated the center of the garden, bearing the family name in livid, living red, but only the heads of the line had individual stone markers, even though this was where all Hyuga came to rest. For everyone else, there was a tiny little building that recorded the names of the deceased on slats of bamboo, rolled into a mat that traced the dead of the clan to before the founding. Tatsuo's father had explained the tradition, the urns of the heads of the clan, containing only the better part of their ashes, the rest shared by their immediate family, were buried beneath a seedling fruiting tree. No one ever ate from them even when they came of age. Their fruit was for the animals, the spirits, and the gods. Choice of tree was dictated by personal preference. Peaches, pomegranates, one ancient, gnarled apple past fruit-bearing age that predated the village. Her tiny urn, her part of Tatsuo, rested on her bedside table, next to his shattered glasses. She wasn't certain whether she was grateful or not that they had managed to follow her home, next to the photo of her shattered team. Sometimes it was almost enough to make her feel obligated to light incense and leave offerings. But instead she wished him good morning when she woke up. She'd been trying to get back into the habit of sleeping in her bed because her father had been home those first weeks and concerned for her, and she didn't feel the need to tell him she'd spent days in the past sleeping beneath the comforting shelter of the kitchen table, and faced that terrible moment where she had to decide to get out of bed and face a world that there wasn't any waking up from. That was the beautiful thing about nightmares and the terrible thing about dreams. They ended. And because people spent every night escaping the things that terrified them by the simple expedient of waking up, it was perhaps a natural human impulse to consider how much easier existence would be if it came to such an end. But it was only in those first moments between here and there, between dreaming and waking, that Sakura ever let herself think of how much she wished she could go back to sleep and never have to face the things waiting in the world, and that only in those first days after she came home. Life was hard and brutal and likely brief, but she wasn't so deep in her misery that she'd forgotten that there were other things besides Tatsuo and missions gone awry in it. It wasn't even really about the loss of her partner, the loss of the squad, the almost loss of her own life. It was about being bone-tired, soul-tired, along with all the tender bits deep inside that still felt strange and fragile whenever she moved. But Sakura made herself get up and get on with it, replacing ruined gear, exercising muscles made weak by chakra healing and bed rest. She'd replaced her broken and unrecovered knife, spending the best part of her bounties on the special steel capable of channeling chakra. If she'd thought sealing scrolls excessively expensive, it was on par with having a knife custom forged at 10 times the rate of a good carbon steel one. She'd seen pictures of weapons made with the steel before, had noted that they were all black, but she thought it was a stylistic thing. As it turned out, the same quirk of the steel that made it capable of channeling chakra meant that it had a glossy black sheen. And because it was so rare, which was part of why it was expensive, only truly talented swordsmiths worked it, which meant that she'd been breathless with admiration at the artistry of the hamon and the sharp, vicious elegance of it when her commission was presented to her. That had been a strangely formal moment, all tea and ceremony, and being glad that Kakashi-senpai was there and feeling like she was accepting art rather than a tool. She'd brought it with her, and she was wearing her new boots. She could hear Ino even now. That knee-high boots with built-in knife sheaths were the epitome of kunoichi sexy, and they even looked half good on Sakura. And a new, sleeveless shirt in black that looked very stark against her pale skin. Its flatteringly tailored lines would look better when she regained the weight she dropped, though as it was worn under her flak jacket, it wouldn't matter regardless. She had a whole pile of new shimak, because she hadn't had the heart to tell her father that she didn't have anywhere to wear pretty dresses or anyone to wear them for, and she'd known he was trying. His sigh of relief when she gently steered him toward an outfitter's rather than a boutique hadn't escaped her either, had made her laugh and feel just that little bit lighter. Today's was one she'd never wear out in the field, all green and pink and white. And her hair had been carefully, meticulously braided. She'd gone on missions with Sakuya's team once she was cleared for duty again, and with her age mates, but she'd saved her new things for this day. Not only would she say goodbye to Tatsuo, within the next week she'd begin the series of supervised assessment missions that would decide whether she'd be reassigned to a new squad or receive Jounin status. 8 separate A-rank missions, each conducted with a different Jounin partner who'd have a say in whether she deserved the promotion, followed by a one-on-one interview with the Hokage. Part of her was honored because she and Hyuga Niji, who was a widely acknowledged prodigy, would begin their assessments at the same time. However, more of her only wished for the courage to say, "No, I don't want to do this anymore," because aberration seemed to be her reality, and how much worse would it be when the missions were meant to be dangerous. But she hadn't. Because she did not want to come to feel accepted and at home with a new team, only to have it snatched away again. She'd lost 2 of them. She'd decided that next time, it would be her partner who was left behind, however callous that seemed. And Kakashi-senpai was a jounin as well as the only person she trusted to survive, no matter what happened. So she'd bite her tongue, give her all, and hope that would be enough. But first she had to get through today. Sakura clutched in one hand a carefully packed bento, and because that hand had started trembling as she'd passed through the threshold, she clasped her other hand tightly over it. "When you're ready," she echoed with bitter irony, punctuating the statement with an uncomfortable giggle. "I wonder when that would be." Fingers clenching tighter on her burden, Sakura forced her feet to carry her forward, eventually seating herself on a rock whose worn, moss-free surface testified to other mourners having made their way here. She carefully unwrapped the salted rice onigiri which had been sharing space with a shallow ceramic bowl and a bottle of hanazake that had required a careful request to Mariko. She'd wanted sake, for tradition's sake, but she needed something above 80 proof for what she intended. Hanazake was 120 proof and not a regular resident of her parents' liquor cabinet. Shoving half of the rice balls to one side and pouring a cup of the hanazake for someone who wasn't there to drink it, Sakura nibbled at her own allotment, snuffling as the salt of her tears mingled with the salt in the rice. She only managed to eat half an onigiri before she had to stop, her stomach clenched tight from grief. She hadn't allowed herself to cry since she'd been released from the hospital, and she'd put this off until she thought she might be able to get through this without sobbing. But this all made it all so very final, the goodbye she'd never gotten. Stealing a sip from Tatsuo's cup for courage and wincing at the taste, Sakura poured the alcohol into the dish she'd brought until it was a little over half full. "If you could see someone you'd lost, even if it was only for an hour, would you be strong enough to resist making your memories into something you could touch?" Sakura wasn't. Not when all it took was chakra and will to see Tatsuo sitting across from her, one leg drawn up to his chest, the other extended comfortably. "Hey," he said fondly, his voice resonating with all the warmth that dwelled in her memories. "Hey yourself," she choked out, smiling through her tears. That familiar grin quirked his lips, but faded quickly into concern. "What are you doing, Sakura?" "I just thought that you should be here for this," Sakura told herself. "Maybe you're really watching, even though they say you should be safely somewhere else by now." But she rose, Tatsuo coming to his feet as well, and she reached out until their hands were palm to palm, their fingers interlaced. She could feel the warmth of his skin, the texture of skin beneath the pads of her fingers, the resistance of bone beneath the thin flesh. This is a terrible thing, she recognized even as she basked in the moment. Some part of her realized that this was something as cruel and certain as any of Guzen's nightmares, offering someone something that they could never have again, granting them the desires that they never voiced to others, giving them one moment and taking all their others, killing them with kindness. But that was a thought for the battlefield, for the future, and in the now there was Tatsuo as she remembered him. As the thought traveled through her mind, for a moment the Genjutsu wavered and it was Tatsuo with his neck gaping and his eyes fading, but she firmed her will and he was whole and hale again. She reluctantly released Tatsuo's hands, stepping backward, and he mirrored her movement. "I wanted," her throat clenched so tight she couldn't speak. "I think I could have loved you," she told him plaintively. "You were everything that I didn't know to want in a partner." "We just didn't have enough time," Tatsuo replied. "Relationships aren't something you just have. There's something you have to build and repair and maintain." Sakura smiled faintly, because those weren't his words. They belonged to another Hyuga, a wholly fictional one, but it didn't make it less true. "Love is a house," she murmured. "It's all about the foundation." She took a deep, unsteady breath and unsheathed her knife. Not the new and shining one, but the one with discolored steel, familiar and comfortable in her hand. With her free hand she pulled her braid taut, and in a single smooth motion, she severed it at the base of her neck. The shorn strands fell forward, just brushing her shoulders where they were hunched by the movement and with tension. She'd never thought about how heavy all that hair was until it wasn't there anymore, almost as strange and disconcerting as being without the armor of her clothes. "I'm going to grow it out again," she told her illusion as she sheathed her knife, crouching to coil the long, braided length in the bowl of alcohol. "Not for anyone else, this time. Just for me, Because I like it. But this was our moment, which sounds stupid and silly to say out loud, but this will always be yours, she murmured, folding her fingers into an unfamiliar hand signs. Katon, she intoned silently, not flinching from the great gout of flame that spilled upward from the bowl, or the smell of melted hair. She owed it to Tatsuo, owed it to herself, not to flinch away. So she refilled the bowl again and again, until there was no more Hanazache and her hair was only ashes to be snatched away by the wind. Red rice. Her mother's fingers were clutched tight on her upper arms and Haruno Mabuki's eyes looked suspiciously damp, her usually stern expression forgotten. Oh, Sakura, she sighed. We are proud of you. But this isn't precisely what you had in mind for me, Sakura said softly, so she wouldn't have to. I know. I understand. I really do. When I graduated the academy, this wasn't what I had in mind for me either. We just don't want to lose you, her mother confirmed. And we've come so close already. And Jounin, we've never had a Jounin in the family before. We can't, there's no connections, no secret jutsu we can give you. I don't need it, Sakura reassured her, her mind flickering to men who'd died because they'd paused for the sight of their mothers, their brothers, their lovers, who'd paid for having a heart. For men who'd been afraid of fire, who'd flinched at the sensation of fear, who'd grown careless when supplied with euphoria. Of enemies who hadn't needed any genjutsu to ease their transition to the afterlife. Not all A ranks involved combat, just the risk of it, but for the assessments they'd chosen missions in which that risk was something closer to a certainty. And because she wanted Jounin not for the rank, not for the money, but for the possibility of a partner who'd stay, she'd put all offer talents on display even when she might have been able to offer swifter ends. She'd learned to compartmentalize it, to push away the guilt, to shut down the strange moral quandary of was it worse to torture a man with horrible images or to take advantage of his softer nature. She wasn't past the nightmares, still felt the weight of it all, perhaps would never escape it, but every day it grew easier to just not think about it. She shifted so that she was cupping her mother's elbows. Sakura met Mabuki's eyes earnestly. All those secret techniques, all that prestige, all that tradition, everything that makes a clan, I didn't need any of it. So don't for a minute regret that it wasn't something you could give me. I'm not ashamed to be in Haruno. But she thought as her mother embraced her, I can't promise that you won't someday be ashamed of me. Sajiso, my thoughts will follow you into your dreams. Jiraiya gazed with bemusement on the letter forwarded to him by his editor, thinking that maybe he'd made some mistake when he was decoding it. But as he eyed first the original and then the one he'd printed out neatly as he worked with that hellish cipher his contact had devised, he discovered that his work was entirely accurate. Which only left him with an ominous feeling building in his bones, because for the better part of a decade, his informant had only one question. But now he had a request. A highly specific request. Jiraiya's brow furrowed as he tried to puzzle out what exactly Uchiha Itachi had in mind when he'd asked for a medic nin capable of staging his death, aside from the obvious. Why within the timeline he'd outlined? What had changed? What had he learned, after all these years? But those were questions without answers and all he could do was burn both sheets of paper and resolve that when he took Naruto back to Konohagakure, he'd put an open-minded medic nin on his shopping list.